Snow fell with the patience of old gods, unhurried and implacable, as though the sky had decided to stitch the day shut one slow flake at a time. Each landed soft upon the stone and the black earth and the cedar-shingled roofs of Winterfell, until the entire keep wore a pale, newly mended skin. In the half-light before dawn, smoke rose from the chimneys in slender gray scrolls, and the morning coals in the great hall breathed their first red whispers under the iron grates. A raven shook free the night on the rookery's rail and left a print like a child's hand in the dusting of white. Jon walked the yard with his cloak unlaced and the cold tucked under it, a knife at his throat that he did not mind. This cold belonged to him. It bit at his cheeks and set the hair on his forearms rising as he ungloved, stretched his fingers, and felt the ache of long turns gripping a sword where, as a boy, he had yearned to hold a name. He had not thought, once, that the stones would feel the same after so much blood. Yet Winterfell's face had always been carved, severe, watchful, indifferently kind. He could sense its gaze on him now as he crossed the yard to where a rack of ashwood practice blades leaned against the stable wall. Ghost came first, silent as breath. The great white shadow padded from the godswood gate, shook powder from his ruff, and pressed his muzzle to Jon's hand. The wolf's warmth came through the skin. It steadied him in ways he felt and could not name. Jon scratched behind the ear, fingers disappearing in the thick pelt, then took a practiced sword and turned to the nearest post. He went through the shapes slowly, the guard, the parry, the strike, felt his shoulders pull and the old gold thread ache in his ribs where a blade had once found his flesh. The sound of wood on wood woke a robin in the bare thorn near the kennels. It scolded his blows as if they were an offense to the peace. A stable boy came to sweep the path of snow and paused once to watch. In the boy's eyes Jon saw the lantern glow of 100 memories. Boys watching him and Robb in this same yard. Boys who had become men and some who would never hold a sword again. He lowered his practice blade and nodded. The boy dipped his head and scrubbed the brush up the steps, careful, earnest, leaving a clean, dark curve on the stone. Ghost wandered off, silent as wind, but Jon felt the wolf's presence like the tug of the heartwood deep in the godswood. He turned, rested the ashwood blade in the rack, and stood with his back to the stables as the light braided itself into the sky. The great hall doors were shut, the iron ring heavy and crusted with frost, but thin leaks of warmth glowed along the edges. He could smell porridge, bacon crackling in a pan, the faint sharpness of onion and the stronger, steadier comfort of fresh bread. He should go inside, speak with Davos, find Sansa. Duties arranged themselves unbidden, leafing like pages. He did not reach for them yet. He breathed and watched his breath turn to pale banners that lifted and fell. Windows in the eastern turret turned opal as the first true light struck them. Sansa would be awake, he thought. She rose early now, as if daylight could be coaxed to arrive by the impatient. He had seen her, these last weeks, set a length of gray thread along the sill to warm and soften in the brittle air before she worked at it. Each morning there was some quiet task, a seam to strengthen in the flag of a house, a tear to sew in a cloak, a child's mitten to patch with a square of felt cut from an old surcoat. He had never asked whose coats. Everything in Winterfell belonged to Winterfell now. Those small mending tasks, he knew, gave her a steadiness that counsels and clamor could not. The world outside could roar and bite. A needle moved patient as the day itself. Up there, Sansa set the needle down and flexed her fingers before the glass. The pane was warped by years of frost and thaw, so that the yard below looked like a pond seen through a ripple. Jon was a dark motion within the ripple, Ghost a long pale brush beside him. She had woken to the sound of a raven's foot on the stone and the low murmur of servants kindling fires. The sky had been black, then flaky with the first gray, now veering toward a pearl that would, by and by, turn to proper morning. She pressed her palm to the cold pane and then lifted it away to watch the steam print fade. She dressed with care, not for finery but for the dignity the hall demanded. Wool over linen, another layer of wool, a surcoat in the stark gray trimmed with fur the color of ash. Her hair she braided backward and wound close, the old way she had worn as a girl at her mother's knee. When she caught her reflection, she had to look twice. The girl she remembered was nowhere to be found. There was a woman whose eyes carried entire winters, whose voice, these days, had to be calibrated to the mood of a room with more precision than any needle required. She turned to the small table where her mending lay and smoothed the seam she had finished at dawn. Then she went to the door. The corridor was bare but for a single candle that had eaten itself into a hollow. She walked past it and down the steps, catching the worn groove in the stone with each descent. A serving woman carrying a stacking of wooden trenchers curtsied. Sansa smiled and took two to lighten the load, and together they entered the dimmer air of the lower passage. The breathing of Winterfell altered with each turn. Kitchens lively and humid, a store of carrots cool and earthen, the door to the yard breathing white. Jon was just inside when she came out. He had pulled his gloves back on, hair dark with a mist of snow. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The silence belonged to them both. She could see he carried the morning's calm like a cloak he did not yet wish to take off. She matched it and offered it back. "Are you hungry?" he asked finally. "I am." She tipped her head toward the hall. "And we have a long table to sit before we rise from it." He gave half a nod, the corner of the mouth that could be a smile if coaxed. Together they turned to the doors. He pulled one open with a grunt, and warmth caught their faces like friendly hands. Inside, the high rafters gathered smoke and held it as if in trust. Pine resin and meat fat braided on the air. There were men already at the benches, soldiers from the hill camps who had come in to thaw and eat before returning to their watches. A cluster of House Glover men-at-arms with the snow still crisp on their boots. 2 Mormont spears with bare-teeth pendants, their cheeks raw from sea wind. Davos sat near the dais, a bowl before him cooling as he read a scrap of parchment by lamplight, lips moving to fetch the thought to the surface. He saw them and stood, folding the parchment into his sleeve. "My lord, my lady." He inclined his head with a sailor's economy. "There's word. Is there ever not?" Sansa took a seat and reached for a slice of dark bread. The crust seamed with salt. "From White Harbor," Davos said, taking his place. "Wyman sends provisions as promised. He regrets the weather delays, and he adds a line that's less tidy." He lifted an eyebrow. "Men at the docks swear they've seen Lannister fletching on the shafts of a certain merchant company's archerguard. Peddlers with long memories, he calls them. Peddlers with longer purses." Jon sipped from the cup a servant set at his elbow. The ale was weak and good. "Spies," he said. "Or worse." Davos looked around to be sure only their nearest men were close enough to catch a loose word. "The gold in King's Landing has a way of finding feet. If the Queen sends something wrapped in trade cloth, we should not count our casks without looking for the spiders that nest behind them. And how much of that is rumor?" Sansa tore her bread, not yet eating, and sorted the pieces with unconscious neatness. "Men speak of the Lannisters as children speak of wolves in the wood. It gives them shape to fear, and it keeps them company." Davos smiled in his beard. "Aye, my lady. Still, the shape is there whether the children speak it or no." Jon put down the cup. The morning's cold persisted in him, a clean edge to his thoughts. "We were going to speak today," he said to Davos, "with the lords, before the noon meal." "So we were." Davos let out a breath. "You'll say what you want to say?" "I will," Jon said. Sansa's gaze tipped from her brother's face. The words still felt useful, if insufficient, and then rose as the hall began to fill. Lord Royce of the Vale came in with 2 of his household men, Ringmail singing softly under his cloak. Behind him, Lyanna Mormont walked with her chin lifted, small and fierce as a winter hawk. Wyman Manderly's envoy was present. A lean, ink-stained man no one would suspect of carrying 3 languages comfortably in his head. Lady Dustin stood like a spear, eyes polished to a soft, dangerous gleam. Others came, the spectrum of the North's faces. Broad farm men with hands shaped by plow handles, iron miners from the hills, horse lords of the grass, salt-haired fishermen who smelled of rope and brine. The room filled to a scene that had grown familiar. The hush a council demanded layered over the clatter of cutlery and the whisper of bread being passed. When the steward struck the rod on the slate, the hall's sounds dimmed. Jon rose. He did not stand on the dais. He did not like the extra height. He stood where the sprawl of tables could see him plain, near enough to touch the edge of the long board. "You know what's been sent from King's Landing," he said. His voice was neither raised nor soft. It moved to reach all the way back without showing its strain. A letter written for a queen and signed with a hand that ordered the fire of an entire temple. The words are courteous. The expectations are not. The North is asked to bend the knee and render fealty. The North is asked for timber, for coin, for men. The North is told the crown will take what is owed, and it is implied the crown will decide what we owe. He let that sit. A murmur moved like a ripple down a row of cloaks, and stilled. "We've lived with this before," Jon said. "We've lived with the South deciding the North will lay down, and we've lifted the dead of it. We don't need reminding, but we owe each other something now that our dead have given us so much room to breathe. We owe each other our care in deciding what we'll ask men to die for. And if there's to be dying, we ought to be sure it isn't for someone else's comfort." A Glover man banged his fist once on the plank. Lyanna Mormont's eyes were as steady as coins on a table. "The North," Jon went on, "should not be a collection of cold pockets waiting for warmer hands. The North is a house, and a house needs a single hinge. We need a name that draws us together and holds. We need a Stark." That was Lady Dustin, her words polished to cut before they left her mouth. "We need a Stark of Winterfell to name and to follow. You've the Stark look, Jon Snow, but you carry a name you've carried since your first breath, and names carry their own weather with them. We've had enough of storms from the south. We need a Stark. We need a Lady of Winterfell who was born to it." Heads turned without trying to hide it, and the air took on the texture of a held breath. Sansa did not flinch. She looked down at her hands and saw the bread bench of childhood, smelled the yeast and flour of the kitchens when her mother laughed and her father came in with snow in his beard. She raised her eyes and let them move to meet Lady Dustin's, then down the long lines to where Jon stood. Lord Royce stirred, the iron in his voice as unbending as his mail. "The veil will not be tucked into a pocket," he said. "We've not marched this far to be told we march under a flag that is uncertain. An oath needs a stone to rest on, not a drift. The girl..." He caught himself and corrected with a short nod. "The lady has a claim. The boy has the love of soldiers. It has to be settled." Davos had a way of moving his weight that prepared the room for sense. He did that now, shifting so his chair squared itself to both Jon and Sansa, and cleared his throat. "You'll not find a stone harder than the old gods," he said. "And you've got a godswood out there with a face that's been watching all this longer than any of us. A thought came to me in the night, and thoughts that come then are sometimes fools and sometimes friends. You've a Stark lady. You've a commander men will follow through any door. Your houses have their reasons for wanting one or the other, and they'll keep arguing those reasons till the snow melts of its own mind. Or," he said, and the word hung a moment, "or you could bind the two into one. You could put the arguing to bed under a single blanket. Not a comfortable blanket, maybe, but warm. A marriage," Davos finished almost gently, "a Stark name on a Stark house. The North led by one hearth." There was a sound then, a sound like the moment a line pulls taut between two hands. It held. No one spoke. Some eyes went immediately to Sansa, some to Jon, some darted, as if seeking a way out of a room too suddenly bright. Sansa felt the room's gaze as if it were a wind changed, cold on the back of the neck, then hot, then something she could stand up under. She answered with stillness because stillness had carried her farther than any noise she could make. Jon did not move his hands. His face did not change. Only Ghost, who had slunk in and taken a place along the wall behind his master, altered position. Lifting his head, ears prick forward, a statue given the courtesy of breath. "Our fathers," Lord Glover began and closed his mouth, aware that the sentence could not end in any way that would avoid the thorns it had already caught. "It would be a marriage that offends the sept," Lady Dustin said, not as an objection so much as a measuring. "And the sept is ash now, and its new queen has less interest in the old god's opinions than in her own. The North has its own remembering of such matters. The North remembers, Lyanna Mormont said, and the last word turned in the air like a key. It remembers girls having to be harder than the men who failed them, and it remembers men breaking promises to girls and getting them killed. It remembers bastards doing more for the living than lords have. It remembers that a house is not a name. A house is what you do. If this is done, we'll call it what it is and do it properly. If it's not, then say so, and we'll settle the other matter. But stop trembling like dogs at the smell of your own stew. A rough laugh went through the benches, grateful for something to fix itself on. Jon found Sansa's eyes across the tables. He knew exactly what was in them because he felt it in his chest. Duty is a word with bones. It has a skull but no face, and you're meant to put your own face on it and walk forward. He looked down from her to the shadow of Ghost and then back. The Sep's opinion is ash, Jon said quietly. The old gods will look, if the old gods look at all, at what we are to the north, not at how some words in the south might be arranged. I won't have the men of the north die because we kept our hands clean of something we only called shame. If a marriage binds us, we bind. And you, my lady? Royce asked, turning the iron of his regard toward Sansa. Are you a stone we can place a hand on and feel unmoving beneath us? If this is done? Sansa drew one slow breath, let it fill the rooms of her chest, and released it without sound. She stood, not because the room's gaze requested it, but because her spine required it. There is a way to do this that remembers everyone we've lost, she said. There's a way to do it that honors the house and asks nothing of the old gods but witness. If it is to be done, we will do it without spectacle. We will do it because it is winter, because the hearth must be kept not for one family but for every child between these walls. If it binds the north, I will bind myself to it. Davos sat as if a turn in a rope had minimized a strain he'd been holding. Lord Glover frowned the way a man frowns when an ache he's gotten used to suddenly disappears, and he is unsure whether to be grateful or suspect a worse one waiting. The envoys murmured among themselves. Royce gave a begrudging nod that stood in for a blessing. It is said, Lady Dustin murmured, so let it be acted. Sansa and Jon left the hall together, because that was what the room would understand as a closure to the subject. Outside, the cold made their eyes water before they could speak. It took a few long breaths for the air to carve their throats into feeling again. It was my thought, Davos said at Jon's side as they walked toward the Godswood. He had come behind them with the unobtrusive presence of men used to walking decks and being invisible to passengers. If the thought offends, put it in my mouth and let it be me who said it. It won't be the first salty thing I've had to swallow. Jon shook his head. You were right to say it. Davos looked to Sansa, his weathered face softening in a way he reserved for daughters and lost sons. My lady, I would have said it myself, Sansa replied. Only I try not to be the one to suggest the thing that will be used against me later. That earned a cracked smile from Davos. Then he fell back a pace and left them to the path. The gods would clasp the cold and made a cathedral of it. Snow stilled the underbrush. The heart tree loomed, a white trunk veined with red, a face that time had smoothed to a calm that would have been cruelty if it were human. The leaf-littered stream wore an uneven lid of ice, clear as glass where the current did not object, fogged white where the water pressed fiercely from below. They stood a little way from the roots. Ghost circled, found a hollow near the bowl and settled, his red eyes half closed but never blind. Jon spoke first, because the silence between them had made room for the words to be measured and the measures were equal. Sansa, he said, what we do here, it can be true and not be what others will name it. I can be your shield and not your bed. We set the terms. We set them now. Sansa's mouth curved with no humor. I have learned, she said. I have learned to read the small writing at the bottom of every promise. The small writing we set here will be the first thing they look for when we are gone. Then let the writing be this, Jon said. We will keep Winterfell. We will keep the North. We will not lie to each other. We will not use each other. And we will suffer together, Sansa added after a beat. Without making each other pay for it. He nodded. The cold made a fine white line at the edges of Sansa's lashes where breath had frozen. He wanted to lift a hand and brush it away. He let the hand hang at his side. "We were raised as brother and sister," Sansa said, as if to remind the tree. "We know what that means. We also know what the North needs us to mean." She lifted her chin toward the face in the bark. "You have watched worse than this. You have seen women given to men they had to pretend to love. You have seen men trust to fates they didn't choose. We choose this. We choose the North." Wind moved through the wood then, a long low word of moving air. It shook dry leaves that had clung stubbornly through the winter and rattled the pendant ice in the willow by the stream. It was not answer and it was not refusal. It was simply what the gods would did, listen and continue. "Davos will find the words," Jon said. "He knows how to thread a needle through a knot." Sansa looked at him sidelong. "He's already threaded it," she essayed. "ID." He set the thread in front of the lords like a ribbon and waited to see who would pick it up. "You pulled one end. I pulled the other. Now it's tied." He almost smiled. She worked with cloth and had found a language he could not improve. "What matters," he said, "is that when they throw stones at it, the knot holds." She stepped closer to the heart tree, placed her palm on its bark. The cold sank into her skin until she could not feel the difference between the weirwood and herself. She found a small knot in the grain and placed her thumb in it as if it were a keyhole. "Mother," she thought, because the tree had no ears that she knew of and the dead did not need to be called by their names to hear. "Father, Bran, Rickon, Robb." Names that were stones in a riverbed. The water moved over them, but they held the shape of the current. She did not speak them aloud. The godswood had long practice in hearing what was not spoken. When she let her hand drop, she did not shiver, though her fingers were chalk white. Jon extended his and she did not take it. Not for refusal, for ritual. She tucked her hands into her sleeves and bowed her head. He bowed his. "We will call the lords again before the sun sets," she said, as they turned back toward the yard. "The words will be short. The witness will be the tree. Let the hall have its feast after. Let them drink themselves full of this decision, so that in the morning it is in their blood and cannot be spat out." "You know how to make a council agree," he said. She gave him a look that could have been amusement. "You fought the dead," she said. "The rest was left to me." Before noon, the castle shifted around the coming act as a hive adjusts to a change in the queen's scent. Servants brushed snow from the stones that edged the godswood path, though the flakes fell again as soon as they had passed. A runner went to the kitchens with a quiet urgency that ripened into frantic competence as slaughter knives flashed and casks were rolled. Davos sat with a piece of charcoal and a scrap of hide and wrote a handful of sentences that were neither oath nor homily but something between. He showed them to Sansa and Jon and watched their eyes move, and when they nodded, not at the same word, he knew it would do. Littlefinger came from somewhere, in the way a stain appears and one cannot say where from. He wore a dark, well-brushed cloak, his mind dressed the same. He placed himself at the edge of the hall in a patch of shadow and observed the pull of the keep toward the godswood. He had the look of a man making a ledger. Columns of gain, columns of loss. When Sansa passed him, he stepped forward as water steps calmly into the space a stone leaves. "A bold solution," he said softly, "and the natural one. Really, once one stops thinking in circles that someone else drew." She did not stop. "There are other words for natural. I have always preferred simple," he said. "The kind of simple that looks complicated from a distance and obvious up close. You and I have spoken often about the North and its need for a spine. You will make a spine. You will hold it straight. And when you tire, there will be hands to steady it." She paused then, long enough to turn her head. "Whose hands?" she asked. He smiled, the sort that suggested a secret that had always been yours. "The ones you trust," he said. "The ones you owe." "I have paid," she said quietly. "Your debt is settled." He inclined his head. "This is a way to keep what you've won. There are very few such ways. I'm pleased you found it." "Do not mistake me," she said, catching his gaze the way one catches a blade with a gauntlet. "I am not marrying Winterfell to you." He watched her go, his eyes narrowing not in anger but in the slow tightening of a noose that he believed he held and had just felt tugged by an unseen hand. The lords gathered with their breath fogging and their furs damp around the hems. The gods would receive them without moving. The faces that arrived were not the faces the hall wore. Men and women came stripped of the theater of the long table. There was a kind of nakedness here that was not vulnerable so much as exposed. The heart tree watched them assemble and continued to stain its own bark with the memory of other winters. Davos stood at the foot of the tree with the hide in hand. He read the first line in a voice like wood drying. "We stand under a face that has watched us longer than our grandfathers' grandfathers. We ask it to look at us now, as we bind a house we did not break." Jon stood to his left, Sansa to his right. They had no rings. There were no rings in the old words of the North. They had no septon because there was no sept to send one, and the old gods used no ordained men. What they had was the air cold enough to make breath visible, and the word of a man who had been saved by mercy and kept alive on ignorance long enough to turn it into wisdom. "We bind as winter binds," Davos continued. "We bind for as long as need requires, and for as long as honor can hold. We bind not to sanctify what we are to each other, but to sanctify what we are to those who look to this house. We bind to give the North one name to answer, one hearth to warm by, one wall to stand behind." It was not poetry. It did not need to be. Sansa reached out and set her palm over Jon's. Open over open, no interlacing of fingers. The contact was light, but she felt the heat of his skin as if a coal had been pressed to hers. She thought of a time when she had been given to a husband who treated her like a bolt of cloth to stitch his house together, and rage rose, old and bright as a fever. It passed her eyes like a cloud passing a moon. It did not stay. "Speak," Davos said. Jon said, "I will keep Winterfell. I will keep its people. I will keep the name given to me in this binding and defend it with my life. I will not waste what we have for pride. I will not lie. I will not demand what you cannot give." Sansa said, "I will keep Winterfell. I will keep its people. I will keep the name given to me in this binding and defend it with my life. I will not trade our safety for the vanity of a queen in a distant city. I will not let the last of our children starve while I count the gold of flattery. I will not lie to you when it would be easier." Davos nodded once, as if to some other voice that had just said the thing he had hoped it would say. He raised the hide and folded it and slipped it into his cloak. "It is done," he said. "If there's any god in attendance here, he's had his say by not striking us dead." There were no cheers. There was a murmur, the sound a room makes when a truth is placed at its center and everyone leans in to see if they can bear it. Lyanna Mormont stepped forward and dove her small fist into the snow at the foot of the tree, took a pinch of it and held it up. She opened her fingers and let the melt run through her knuckles. "That's the North," she said. "Cold that burns, wet that feeds, bone that holds. You too remember that if you begin to forget." The lords filed out toward the hall, back to their wine and their self-congratulations, which would soon enough become arguments disguised as toasts. Sansa and Jon stood until the last breath of the gathered crowd had been taken away by the pines. "Are you all right?" he asked at last. She looked up at the face in the bark. The eyes of the heart tree were red. They had always been red. "I am not what I was," she said, "but I am all right." They moved to leave the godswood when a raven, bold and black as an ink blot, settled on a branch over the path and said a single hard syllable, a sound that was not a word and yet caught on the edge of words. It tilted its head with the casual insolence of things that fly and watched them pass beneath. In the hall, the celebration had the quick heat of something necessary to the blood. The long tables groaned under platters of boiled beef glistening in fat, pale fish laid open and glittering where the knife had gone through, bread dense as stone but warm at the center. Mugs marched down tabletops and fell over and were set up again and marched again. Men slapped shoulders. Women shook their heads and refilled the mugs. The air thickened with joy that had been asked to be joy, which is not the same as joy freely arriving, but it could sustain a long winter night if fed properly. Tormund found Jon with the simple arrow of a man who has decided toward whom to walk and then does it. He swung an arm around Jon's shoulders and squeezed until a bone somewhere protested. "So," he said, his beard transporting half a loaf of bread he had eaten earlier, "now you marry like the kings of old. I had a wife once, too." He held up fingers and waggled them. "Not at once, not on purpose. But if you want advice, I'll lose it in that beard," Jon said, with more warmth than the words suggested. "Advice is sticky," Tormund said. "It stays whether you want it or not." He leaned in, narrowed his eyes past the steam of a trencher of stew. "This the one who fed you soup as a boy? Or the other one?" "The same," Jon said. We did it for the house." "Aye." Tormund's nod was surprisingly solemn. "Sometimes you do a thing for the tent, not the fire. The fire wants to run free and burn everything. The tent needs not to collapse when it snows." Sansa, on the dais for the sake of order though she would have preferred a corner, gave her time to a procession of lords who wished to be seen saying the right words. Lord Glover spoke first, and though his mouth was stiff, what came from it was not poison. House Serwyn's man wore the grieving look of someone for whom a victory tastes like someone else's memory. He found his sentence somewhere near his boots but sent it up properly with a slow nod. Wyman's envoy had words that buckled under the weight of the meaning he had been asked to carry across ice. She eased them with her own presence and sent him away with gratitude that surprised neither of them. Royce bowed in the southern fashion and then simply stood, feeling the odd comfort of a stone that refused to shift under his weight. When at last the line of obligation thinned, Littlefinger arrived with wine poured to a generous finger's breadth too much. He gave it to her and stood just far enough away to require her to step toward him. "Every union requires an enemy," he murmured, voice for her alone, though they both knew the room would supply echoes. "If you two cannot be enemies to each other, you will need to find one common enough to feed all the appetites in this hall." "I have an enemy," Sansa said, her mouth barely moving. "She sits a throne of knives. Knives dull." He smiled. "People sharpen them, then let them sharpen." When he had gone, he knew when to go as well as he knew when to stay. It was a trick that had saved him more than once. Davos came to her with a plate he had filled with more sense than extravagance. Thick slices of beef, a second slice of bread, a wedge of sharp cheese. He handed it to her like one might present a written order. She took it and ate with appetite, gratified to feel her hands steady and her stomach accept the food without argument. The night lengthened as winter nights do, with the deceptive sensation that it could last forever and then the sudden knowledge that it will not. The Ravenry sent out 3 birds into the dark bearing a draft of the words Davos had written. One south by southwest, one west by a notch toward the sea, and one east toward the salt marshes. The men who loosed them watched until the black vanished in black and then stood a moment longer because habit is often a better master than sense. When the hall at last quieted, when even Tormund had found a bench and a cloak and stopped roaring long enough to stumble into sleep, Jon went out into the yard. The snow had eased. It fell now in sparer coins, lighter, as if the sky had spent itself in the day's decisions and was content to make tokens of its approval. He went by habit toward the practice rack and found instead the need to descend to the crypt. The torches guttered once at the shift in air and then slowly adjusted to his presence. Stone breath met him as it had always met him. Cool, dry, an absence that could be a comfort if one let it be. He passed the figures he knew by their shadows before he knew them by their carved faces. The hum of the hall ended at the arch that opened onto the steps. This place had its own silence. It wrapped him like a cloak he had forgotten he owned. Ned Stark stood in stone with the same generous severity he had carried in life. There were moments as a boy when Jon had crept here to make himself small enough to tell this man things that had no ear anywhere else. Tonight he stood before the carved face and waited for something as fancy as a blessing and was given instead the steady counsel of whatever Ned Stark had planted in him long ago. "You do what is in front of you," said the stone. "You do the thing that makes the next true thing possible. You do not do the comfortable thing if comfort is a liar." Jon bowed his head. He did not speak. He stayed until the cold reached the bones in his toes and then a bit longer, because there are some discomforts it is good to acknowledge without giving them what they wish. When he came up, the sky had cleared beyond what one could reasonably ask of a winter night. Stars laid themselves out like beads threaded through black velvet. The kind of cold that makes sound travel clean ran the yard's length and set every footstep to seeming loud. He saw her under the angle of the turret steps, a shape assembled of furs and resolve. He did not guess. He knew her. "Sansa," he said. She turned her head without lifting her shoulders from the stone. "I only wanted to feel the night," she said. "It is a thing I was not allowed to have once. They kept night close as if it were a jewel they owned." She smiled, small. "I had to borrow it when I could." He stood beside her. The stone under the steps drank heat from the body and gave none back. They did not touch. The air pinned their cloaks against them like the hands of an industrious mother. "Davos will want to send more letters in the morning," Jon said. "To the Riverlands, to the Vale again. He'll want your words on them." "He can have them," Sansa said. "He has mine on most things now. We complement each other oddly well. It makes men nervous." "Good," Jon said. "I spoke to Lord Royce again after the hall emptied," she added. "He wanted to be sure we knew that the Vale's loyalty goes where the boy at the Eyrie tells it to go, which means it goes where I ask it to go. He wanted me to be sure." "And are you?" She was quiet long enough that he could hear the soft scratch of a mouse under the steps. "I am sure of what I will say to him," she answered at last. "That is not always the same thing." He turned that over. The truth of it did not feel like surrender. It felt like an adjustment that kept the ship moving when the wind changed. They watched the breath of their words drift above them and vanish. Some things are easier said in a place where everything said is immediately shown in smoke and then nothing. "You were brave today," Jon said. "I have learned to measure words by the damage they prevent," Sansa said. "It is a boring bravery, but useful." "I'll take useful," he said. "I've had enough of glory." A silence that was not empty followed, each of them rehearsing a dozen obligations they did not need to speak. A banner cracked on its staff somewhere in the yard, a small flag adjusting itself to a breeze that refused to settle. Ghost slipped by, ghost indeed, dragging his tail through a light drift so that it left a line that would be scuffed away by the next passerby. He paused before Sansa and lifted his head to sniff the cold that ran in threads through her fur collar. She reached with the back of her hand and touched a patch between his eyes, and he closed the eyes like a man receiving a benediction. "I'll sleep now," she said, and the words had a stubborn optimism to them, the kind that defies nightmares by already having spoken sleep's name aloud. "I'll be a while," he said. "Of course." She moved from the step, and the absence of her left a small, precise shape in the air that he knew would close itself too quickly to have ever existed. She climbed the steps, her fur soft in the starlight, the line of her back sure. He watched until the door took her. In King's Landing, a courtier who had once believed himself to be a poet and discovered, to his advantage, that he was better at fear than at meter, placed a folded sheet of thick cream paper on a tray and carried it at the precise angle that indicated deference without suggesting servitude. He bent a knee without forcing a sound from it and left the paper on a small table beside a chair no one else was permitted to sit in. He left the room. The paper breathed in the still air. The Queen took up the paper between forefinger and thumb, which are sufficient to lift anything if your will is properly trained. She read the lines once. Her face did not do anything so gauche as change. The candle nearest the chair gave a tiny sputter as a bit of its own wick fell into itself. She looked past the words to the wall, where a map now stained the whitewash with a confidence an artist had overcharged her to purchase. The north was a shape that dwarfed the others. It dwarfed because the painter had understood what has always been true. Emptiness that men are afraid of will always look larger than a city full of eyes. She called for Qyburn. He came with a step so light he might as well have been an idea of a step. "They declare," she said, and did not look at him. "Put a pin in the wolf's head. I tire of looking at its clean jaw." "Of course, your grace," he said. "And the Riverlands?" "The Riverlands will follow whatever hand," she said. "We will decide the hand. Send word to the twins. Tell them that salt tastes better when it's had time to soak. And send something heavier to White Harbor wrapped in the linen of kindness." "Which sort of kindness, Your Grace?" Qyburn asked, as if one were choosing between types of apples. "The remembered kind," she said. "The sort that makes old men cry." He bowed his head to hide the satisfaction that warmth can bring to cold projects. His shadow left the room before he did, because the candle had guttered a little and posture is quicker than flame. In the morning, the world would begin to move in the new grooves the decision had cut. Messengers would cross sheets of white like ink drawing borders on a blank. Men would set to arguing in their bunkhouses about whether this was wise or only the only available choice. Women would tuck extra bread into the hands of their children, as if bread itself could stand as shield against any queen at any distance. The day would bring work with it, as it always did. But for this piece of night, Winterfell allowed itself to sleep like a creature that had found the place it could settle. The snow striped the battlements and softened the spear points. The wolves in the woods beyond the outer wall trotted their narrow roads and did not bother to sing, because singing calls what one cannot see, and tonight everything was present already. Jon went at last to his chamber and stood in the darkness without moving. The shape of the bed was unfamiliar, and he did not light a candle to make it otherwise. He leaned his head against the wooden post and closed his eyes and saw, as vividly as if it were painted behind them, a face carved in white wood whose expression never changed. He could still feel the press of Sansa's palm. Over his, it had been the lightest of touches. He felt, beneath that memory, the weight of a great city far to the south arranging knives in its drawers like a careful housekeeper. Between those two weights there was a space in which a man could walk. He opened his eyes. The darkness remained. The space remained also. He lay down and fell into sleep as he used to fall into snowbanks as a child, with a premeditated surrender and the small joy that never announces itself. In the cold depths of that sleep, men and women he had known, and men and women he had only ever guessed at, passed by as people pass a door where someone newborn lies. They paused and looked in and said nothing. He slept through their passing. Sansa slept less, but she slept with stubbornness. When she woke once at a sound, the light tread of a servant, perhaps, or a dream setting down a cup too hard, she lay still and recited the order for the morning in her head until her breath learned the count of it and returned to a steadier pace. She did not resist the small tremor that ran from shoulder to wrist and back. She watched it and allowed it to go. Then she turned her face to her pillow and slept again. At dawn, the castle exhaled, and breath fogged the hall and the yard in equal measure. A boy in the rookery tied a ribbon around a raven's leg and whispered to it that the words were light and that it could carry them easily. It cocked its head and did not contradict him. A woman at the outer gate lifted the bar and said to the man beside her that the wood had swollen and that it would be a long spring of tools needing care. A young Mormont spear maiden sharpened her blade with a whetstone a cousin had given her, thinking the stone itself had a memory of battle that it could share. An old man woke and didn't know where he was for a moment and then smiled because he remembered that he was not anywhere but home. The day began to lace itself together. Jon came to the yard and found Sansa watching the track of the sun through a break in the cloud. Her hair was bound close again, the braid precise. He moved to stand beside her and did not speak. He handed her a leather glove she had left on a bench the night before. Their fingers touched in the exchange. She slid it on, and for a moment, an ordinary moment held without ceremony, they were merely two people in a courtyard gathering the day as it offered itself. Cold, certain, and wide. "Letters," she said, without looking away from the sky. "Letters," he agreed. "Royce leaves at noon," she said. "He wants to be at the Bloody Gate before the next storm." "We'll give him what he needs," Jon said. She nodded. The sky shifted from pearl to a gray with the barest thought of blue in it. She pulled her cloak tighter and turned. "Come," she said. "Let's decide how we are remembered." They walked to the hall and the castle, which had told its own stories all night, quieted to listen. They laid the correspondence out in a measured disorder that pleased Sansa. because it let her eye fall from one to the next as if she were walking through a wood and choosing which path to take without losing sight of the others. Davos had found good vellum in a storeroom none of them remembered stocking, and the wax for the seals had been warmed in a bowl set near a brazier until it yielded to the stamp without crumbling. The direwolf's head went into the wax with a small, satisfying resistance and came away clean when Jon lifted the seal. "White Harbor first," Sansa said. "Not because they are far, but because they are near in ways that matter. Their grain comes to us on sleds when the drifts are high. Their men know our roads by sound." Davos tilted the scrap of charcoal in his hand and began a draft in a spare square of light. Sansa paced and spoke. Jon listened, standing as he did sometimes when his body needed to be as still as his thoughts. Arms crossed under the cloak, weight even on the heels, jaw set not in stubbornness but to keep the mouth from wasting words. "Lord Manderley," Sansa said, "knows the scales of a bargain and the songs of old loyalties. We ask him not for coin, but for his cunning. If Lannister gold is moving along the coast, it will pass through hands he has counted himself, even if they never know he touched it. Ask for lists, but don't write lists. Write notes sent in friendship." "Friendship?" Davos said, smudging the word until it looked as if it had been there all along. "And the envoy?" Jon asked. "We'll need a voice to carry the weight a raven can't." "He sent two," Sansa said, and the correction mended a thread that had frayed elsewhere. It soothed her to notice it and to fix it. "The scribe who smells of ink and salt, and the woman with the merchant's eye. One can count, the other can persuade. We'll ask them both to carry our words back and listen for replies that aren't written." Jon nodded. He warranted that more could be done with a pair of ears than with a quiver of well-feathered arrows. When Davos raised his head, he met Sansa's eye. "And the smaller houses?" he asked. "Carhold, Hornwood. The Dustins won't need convincing, but they'll want attendance." Sansa moved to the map laid over the table, palmed flat by small stones so old her palm could feel the wear of a dozen hands. Her finger traced the road north and east. "Alice Karstark will send what she can," she said. "Her people have been made to feel the cold at another's insistence for too many years. If we send her a ward when spring comes, a girl of a good family, not as pledge but as a guest, it will say we mean to weave our houses rather than nail them together. For Hornwood, we send patience. Their forests have been chewed at on every side. They need to be allowed to say they are hesitant and have us nod and give them time. Lady Moores will say yes after she's said no 3 times. "And the Umbers," Davos said. "You'll write a letter that invites them to Winterfell in 3 months' time," Sansa said. "It will take them that long to finish the words they are saying to their dead. Let them not be hurried." Jon let out a breath that wanted to be a laugh and decided against it as it left. "You know every door in this house," he said. "The house is big," Sansa said. "The doors are many. If we push at all of them, we'll end with doors closing that we need to keep open." Davos folded the draft and began a clean copy. The roughness of the quill on vellum made a quiet rasp that, to Sansa, had more truth in it than most speeches men like to memorize and bring to tables like this. When he finished the first, he handed it to Jon, and Jon pressed the seal. The wax cooled. The wolf's face held. The messages to the Riverlands took longer to shape. Names in that part of the map came with old smoke char that smudged the fingers. Mallister, Blackwood, Piper. The phrase of the twins occupied the middle of the thoughts like a chair that cannot be moved to make room for others without scraping marks on the floor. They would not write to Walder, Sansa decided. If there was a Walder still to be written to, it did not matter. Men who had learned to accept the sound of their own fawning made poor allies against a woman like Cersei. Better to write to those the phrase made suffer. "Raventree Hall will answer," Davos said. "They've defied worse hungers. And the Mallisters keep their own counsel. The sea squeezes truth out of a man. They're like that. Write them. We have no coin to spare, but we can spare information. We'll make a trade of it." "And Edmure Tully?" Jon asked. "Is he a name we can set to a letter and expect it to go where the man is?" "Edmure is a hostage to the idea of Edmure," Sansa said. "Wherever they keep him, There's a shadow of him hung over his house. Write to the space. Tell it we are not trying to use it as a door without a key. People are kinder when they are treated as more than what has been done to them. If he answers, we are heard. If he does not, we have been seen to speak. When that was done, they turned to the veil. The words for that letter they did not write in one sitting. Sansa took the draft and walked with it around the room, and then into the corridor, and then into note pieces of the morning, and did not return to lay it flat until the cold had bitten the tips of her ears into alertness. Davos had finished 3 other letters in the time she took to make that one line like a river instead of a ditch. She set the draft before him without apology and went to the window to see if the light had changed. Lord Royce, she wrote, in the voice she would use upon entering a room of men too fond of divisions to be of war. There are oaths in the veil that mean more than the words that carry them from mouth to mouth. We ask you to stand by what the veil has already done. We ask you to return to us as many of your knights as your judgment says can be spared without endangering the boy you keep. We ask you to accept that the North will not be led to the South by any leash, no matter how soft or how heavily perfumed with scents. If you want to protect your young lord, you will not drive him into a war he cannot understand. If you want to protect the Vale, you will place your trust in those who know the snow. She left space under that for what Davos called a sailor's promise. Exactly what would be given in exchange, neither more nor less. They would send grain, as much as they could measure without starving their own. They would send cloth. They would send stone rights in the spring to mend roads that winter had broken. Sansa refused to write a deed they could not perform. Davos, who had ruined his own life once by promising too much too readily to too many, approved without comment. A boy from the rookery came for the first bundle of letters just before the sun had fully rouged the windows. He stood with his cap twisting in both hands, the eagerness of a boy trusted with something larger than himself, warring with the terror that he might break it and become once more only hands and back. Sansa handed him a small packet and spoke very quietly to him with words that would give him a picture to hold, because that would hold him steady. "You'll take this to the courtyard," she said. "You'll find Marna with the gray scarf. Her gloves are too big for her fingers. She has a scar on her left wrist. Give the letters to her. Say nothing else. She'll know where they go." The boy nodded and, because he was smart, said the instructions back to her. When he left, his feet made no sound. "Wolken says the fever runs low in the East Barracks," Jon said a little later, when the last of the letters for the first dispatch were stacked like cakes cooling by the brazier. "He wants clean straw and more vinegar. He sent a man to the marsh for willow bark." "I'll go," Sansa said. "You don't," Jon began. "I wasn't asking," she said, and regretted the bite as soon as it left. "It isn't much," she added, softening, so the sting washed out with it. "It's not plague, old air and too many lungs in it. A day with the shutters open and proper drink and it will creep off. I like the men to feel seen when they're ill. No one likes being made invisible in their beds." Jon's expression altered somewhere between apology and acceptance. If he had learned anything from his own deadness and returned to this smaller life, it was that small mercies keep a house standing when stone will not. He turned the seal in his palm as he watched her go. In the barracks, the air was sour with breath and the sourness of stale cloth heated and cooled too many times without washing. Sansa took the shutters and opened them despite the men's immediate groans at the cold. She scolded them like a mother for show and then put blankets back over shoulders that had forgotten how to hold warmth. She moved from bed to bed with a cup of water cut with weak ale and willow, and with a fine needle and thread in a little leather roll she had tied to her wrist with a strap. She mended a torn sleeve while talking to the man it belonged to about his mother's bread, which he had described last week as if it had been a saint. She made a woman with a cough laugh by asking the cough a question, as if it were a companion sitting on the straw chewing loudly enough to interrupt. Maester Wolken watched from the doorway for a long time without being noticed and finally went away because his presence would have made the scene about healing and it was already about something more useful. When she came back to the hall, she smelled of willow and men, of vinegar and the air itself. Jon looked up and knew from the way she touched the table's edge that the fever was less dangerous than a rumor if left to run. Davos was teaching a very young scribe how to fold the outer edges of the letters so that no snow could enter under the wax. The scribe's tongue was bitten between his teeth in concentration, and his hair stuck there like a prickly brush. When he saw Sansa, he tried to stand. "Stay," Davos said, a hand keeping him where the lesson could continue. "If you've got both hands doing something, you're less likely to make a mess of the rest of the world." They broke for food when the bells in the kitchen chimed with the dull sound that meant the porridge was thick enough to hold a spoon upright. Jon took a wooden trencher and a clay cup and ate his portion with soldier's efficiency, then slowed as the heat spread and the hunger eased. Sansa ate more than he did, which pleased him. He had long ago stopped measuring women by how little they permitted themselves. Outside, the snow had turned deceptive. It fell in flakes so light they vanished on reaching the ground, and yet a quarter hour later the road outside the hall would have a new softness at its edges that had not been there. Davos called it the sort of snow that knows how to take something from you without informing you that it had asked. The first trouble came at second bell when a man with red ears and a scar across his knuckles presented himself at the lower gate and offered a wagon load of oiled cloth and salt fish for winter stores. His cart bore no crest. He had a letter, but the seal was a sunburst no house in the north claimed as its own. The guards did what the guards had been told to do when anything new presented itself. They took the man to Davos and set the cart aside and asked the man to show his hands again and again, as if new daggers might have grown on them during the walk. Davos looked at the letter with his good eye and his other in reserve. He turned it over, then returned it to the man. "It's a pretty seal," he said. "You pay for that in King's Landing. Good coin for a man clever enough to stamp something with a mark of nothing. You come from a distance." "Old Town," the man said, too quickly. Davos watched men at sea lie for all sorts of reasons. He recognized the way this one stood within his lie. Full weight on one foot, the other foot ready to be first away if the lie was lifted and he needed to run beneath it ahead of its collapse. "You left Old Town with salt fish?" Davos asked. A small smile crushed into his beard. "No, friend. You came from the west coast, or something came with you from that side." "Alone?" The man's eyes flickered to the cart. Just once. Davos didn't look at it, not yet. He looked at Sansa, who had arrived without making noise and stood listening like snow settling. "Shall we take the oil and be done with the talk?" he asked, the tone an invitation. The man's shoulders relaxed at the offer. Sansa stepped forward then, her voice the light touch of a hand on a bolt of cloth to test its weave. "If you came from Old Town," she said, "you passed through the Mander. And if you pass through the Mander, you know the smell on the mud this time of year is different to the smell in spring. What does it smell like now?" The man had not expected a question whose answer did not require the invention of a cousin's cousin. He hesitated. "Of river," he said. "Of rot that hasn't decided whether to be new or old," Davos said, saving him from having to invent the wrong leaf. He lowered his head toward the cart. "Open it," he told one of the guards. "The wrong thing will stink the same no matter where it comes from." They found it beneath the sacks of oilcloth. A sheaf of bows wrapped in tarred linen, the feathers of the arrows still rough where they'd been fletched in haste. Red and black bands marked the shafts. Someone had tried to stain the bands with mud. The mud had fallen away where it dried and flaked. On one shaft, the bands ended in a small gilded knot. "Tidy work," Davos said, admiration and condemnation in equal parts in his voice. "It would pass a hurried watch with eyes half shut, but we sharpen our eyes up here to see through snow. Throw the fletching to the fire," he told the guard. "Keep the oilcloth and the fish. Honest fish doesn't need a crest. As for you," he said, turning back to the man with the red ears, "you'll stay a day while we consider whether to hang you by your heels." The man shook his head, astonishment and fear sharing the carriage of it until it looked almost like a refusal. "I was told there was coin here," he said. "I have children." Sansa could have let the fear say the rest of it. Instead, she helped the man finish the thought without dignity being broken. "You were told to take the coin and take the praise and take the praise to the next man and buy a sword with it," she said. "And you did not ask to whom your children would belong when the buying was done. No matter," she added. "Davos," "We will not hang you," Davos said. "Not today. Not for being stupid enough to carry a lie with feathers sticking out of its sides. You'll sleep in a cell that doesn't stink if you're polite. You'll tell us where you stopped on the way. And if you want your children to have a father come spring, you'll do what we ask next." The man swallowed the air and the offer in a single gulp and followed the guards away as eagerly as he would have followed a plate of stew. "Crows with gold in their beaks," Davos said once they were alone with Jon. "King's Landing is trying on a second shape. They couldn't find the North with an army. They're going to try to buy it piece by piece. We'll set out bowls for them to drop their coins into and see if we can pull out where they're standing." "You mean to let some of it through?" Jon asked. "I mean to watch the road widen or narrow by how the merchants move," Davos said. "They think they're hunters. We'll treat them like fish and see who tugs the line." Sansa went to the window and watched the last of the day's light give itself to the snow without a show. "We'll need men we trust at the toll points," she said. "We'll need to give them more than orders. Orders are easier to shake off than something a man can carry in his pocket and touch with his fingers when he has to remember why he said yes to this in the first place." "What would you give them?" Jon asked. "Names," Sansa said, turning to him. "The names of their children written in a hand they recognize. The knowledge that we know who they love and that we will pay our attention first to the people they are expected to feed when the winter is sharpest. And enough coin that they won't be tempted by a larger purse in front of a hungry hearth." "That last one," Davos said, "is always the right size until it isn't. We'll try to guess the right size. The rest will be down to luck and to whether their mothers brought them up with a sense of shame." The day held to its slow widenings. In the afternoon, a group of free folk boys who had been housed in the southern stables to keep them from fighting with the miners' sons dared one another to sit on the edge of the well while Tormund regaled them with a story about a bear that turned into a woman or a woman who had been a bear, depending on whether the boy listening needed a lesson about not touching what wasn't offered or not boasting about what had been. When the boys began to lean too far over the well and the story reached a part that required Tormund's hands to become the bear, he snatched them back by the collars and shouted, "Don't let the well marry you. It's cold and deep and it doesn't know your name." The boys tumbled backward in a heap. One scraped his palm and looked as if he might cry. Tormund took the hand in his own enormous one, bent and blew on it, and the boy did not cry because surprise had replaced pain. "There," Tormund said, "you're better than when you started." Sansa watched that from a distance and felt the odd joint pain of tenderness that comes when some new capability of a place you love reveals itself. She went on toward the smithy, where two of Glover's men were arguing with a flint over the best way to set an iron strap on a cracked shield. The smith, a woman with a wrestling scar white across her neck, let them talk and then did it her way in the iron's time, not theirs. "The metal knows," she said without looking up. "You can argue all day and it will still want the heat where it wants it." Maester Wolkan found her again near dusk, as she stood with Jon in the lengthening shadow under the east wall and counted inward instead of outward for a few breaths. "My lady," he said, "my lord, a moment with your attention." He had a face Sansa had come to trust not for its expression but for the way it never tried to make its feelings someone else's problem. He had survived one house's fall by learning to never be surprised at what men could do when handed the justification of necessity. He had kept himself from drowning in Bolton service by letting the work remain the work. She had never once seen him smile except in the direction of a child, and even then, his smile looked like a man has when he puts down a useful tool and looks at it anew. "The fever will pass," he began, which told Sansa he had decided to bring something else. "I've had a raven. I thought it best to show you the scroll." He produced it from within his sleeve. The seal was broken cleanly. It had been closed with yellow wax impressed with a small rose. "Highgarden," Jon said. Wolkan inclined his head. "More properly, Marjorie is dead. The rose will be someone else's herald. But there are still men with roses on everything they own. This comes from a steward who thinks himself a lord, and therefore has already aged 10 years from the trouble he is about to have." Sansa took the letter and read. Jon waited, because he had learned to judge a letter by the changes in Sansa's throat more reliably than by the careful arrangement of the words. When she had done, she passed it to him. "The South is hungry," she said. "They've word of grain stores being bought up by men they do not know. They ask if we know them. They ask to pay for names. They would like to keep their bread." Jon's eyes moved over the neat lines. When he finished, he held the letter to the light as if the ink would show a second sentence between the first and the paper. "We could sell them the names we don't have," he said. "But the names would turn men to ash. I won't do Queen Cersei's work by thinning another house's table." "No," Sansa said. "But we might sell them this. Send your grain north. We'll pay for it with iron and with men when spring comes, if it must. We can store what you cannot. We know how to keep a winter room better than you do. Your wheat will be eaten here or there. Better it be eaten by our children than by House Lannister soldiers while they sit outside your walls waiting for your lord to ask the queen's pardon." "And the one who wrote this?" Jon asked Wolkan. "Desperate men wait the length of a prayer," Wolkan said. "He will wait until tomorrow, and then he will send another letter elsewhere, and then he will try to look like the man who knew whom to come to first when he comes to you begging you to write again. Write to him," Sansa said. "Tell him we are not buying names, but we are buying time, and that time can be measured in wagons. He'll understand that better than any sermon." Jon folded the letter and gave it back to Wolkan. "Ask him to tell us what roads men he doesn't know are walking," he added. "Desperate men see much. We'll pay him in ink if we have to." Wolkan bowed, the kind of bow that came of many years of putting his spine carefully where other men went about bending necks. He withdrew and left them again with the wall and the sky above it, which was turning now toward a kind of darkness that arrived not by degrees but by a stillness that suddenly found a shape. "He is not wrong," Sansa said, almost without sound. "We're buying time. We always have been," Jon said. "It's all any of us ever buy." That night there was a theft. It was small, which made it exactly the size to show what it needed to show. Someone took 2 sacks of oats from the 3rd storehouse. They knew it had happened because House Reed's man, sent in on feet that did not believe in roads and eyes that could find their own footprints in a drift an hour later, had placed a thread across the door at the bottom, set in such a way that even a careful hand could not lift it without breaking the twist. The thread was broken. The sacks were gone. There were the prints of 1 pair of boots in the snow and 1 pair of bare feet beside them. The bare feet's prints became smudges 10 yards from the storehouse and disappeared into an area where the snow lay meaner than before. The boots went on toward the low outer wall and over it and took their trail to the quarry. The trail told a story, and so did the stone. Jon found the boot's owner less than an hour after he started looking, because Ghost went before him like a white thought and knows old blood called to the scattered flakes of the man's sweat fallen in the snow. The man lay under an outcrop in the quarry with a child tucked into the fold of his cloak and the sacks laid as a windbreak. The child's feet were wrapped in burlap that had bled a small fine stain into the snow. Jon looked at the man first and then at the child and then back at the man, and where another might have put anger, he put the picture of a boy and a man he himself had once been, and the cold of the night ahead, and the sound of men in a corridor walking past a door where someone hid because if he did not hide he would have to explain why he had taken more than he had been given. The man's chin lifted when he realized who knelt with him under the rock. He did not reach for the sacks. His hand went instead toward the child's head, as if he could make the child smaller by pressing it closer to the small, shivering body. "I'll give it back," he said, and then he closed his mouth because the lie tasted like iron. "You'll give me your name first," Jon said. The man swallowed. "Breck," he said, "an axeman from Barrowton when there were wages to be had for swinging it and something to cut besides your own pride." "And the child," Jon said. "My sister's girl," Breck said, after a stillness where his tongue must have tried other words and come back to that one. "Sera. They didn't have the heart to come to the gate with me. I thought I could take it and take her and tell them the wind blew better somewhere else." "The wind blows how it wants," Jon said. He took his gloves off 1 finger at a time and then put his bare hand on the child's forehead. It was hot. He could feel the heat even in this cold. He pulled the burlap up and saw the feet, the raw red of flesh that is only small because it does not yet know how to turn into a scar. He set the burlap back and looked out into the quarry and into the night that only dared to be night, because when you are a knight like this, there is nothing anyone can do to shame you into being less. He put 2 fingers to his mouth and whistled low. Ghost came without sound. Jon untied the laces of his own boots and pulled his feet out and held the boots in his hands as if he might crush them. He set them down next to the sacks and then lifted the child so the boots could be put on her feet that were too small for them. He wrapped the burlap around her outside the leather and held the small leg from knee to ankle until heat seemed to think it might wish to remain in that limb for a few more hours. The child did not cry. She blinked at him with eyes that looked older than they should have. He saw in them the patient attention of the very young to the world that moves them without asking for their opinion. "You'll come with us," he told Breck. "You won't run. If you do, I'll send Ghost, and you won't like what he brings back to you." Breck nodded, and the nod was gratitude and decent fear together. "You'll give me those sacks, and tomorrow you'll stand in the hall and I'll tell everyone what you did, and then I'll tell them why you did it and that you're a fool for thinking we don't know where our food goes. I won't humiliate you. You've done a good enough job of that. But you'll take the first place in line when Weston calls for the men to shovel out the south path. And if you vanish, I'll send a raven to Barrowton with your name. It will find you anywhere you go." Breck nodded again and did not speak, because finding the right words to hold that graceless mercy would have required a different kind of man than he was. Jon carried the child back to the gate, and the men there stood aside without needing to be told how to make a space. Sansa came to them before they could send for her, and she took the girl in her arms like the girl had been given to her by Wolkan at the end of a day's long waiting. She said the child's name once under her breath and went to the kitchen to have someone heat oil in a shallow pan and to steal clean rags from under the noses of the women who counted rags like coins. Wolkan appeared without having been called and brought a small crock of goose fat and a look that told Jon he would not keep his boots if he so much as tried to leave the hall without taking someone else's. "Keep those feet there," Wolkan told Sansa. "In the air. Keep them above her heart. She'll hate it and she'll love you for making her hate it. That's how this work is done." "This work is tiresome," Sansa said. "Most good work is," Wolkan replied. The next morning began with a sound that had been rare in Winterfell for too long. It was the sound of men laughing without spending the laugh on a point to be made. Breck, who did not deserve the name he had given himself and would have to find his way back to the one his mother and father had first given him, arrived with his sister and the girl in the lower hall while the stew was being ladled, and when Davos stood and said, "Here is what was done and here is what was done about it," the men listened as if they were learning a recipe and not a moral. He did not name the girl, which was mercy. He did not name Breck, which was caution. He told instead the story of the 2 sacks and the thread and the prints in the snow and the boots on Jon's feet and the grease on Wolkan's hands and the way Sansa's brow had furrowed when the child disliked being made to do what would save her. The story set the room on the same side of a thing without anyone having to make the polite noises men make when asked whether they agree with their own good sense. After that, the work of the day unfolded as work does when it has been given a reason to exist beyond itself. The kitchen sent thick slices of oatcake to the men going out with shovels. The stable's hay was counted and recounted, and then the man who had done the counting wrote numbers down with his tongue sticking out. The smith hammered an iron strap into a shape that overcame the will of the shield it meant to hold together. The laundresses cut a new rag to replace the one Sansa had stolen and made a small noise of satisfaction at how the torn edges squared under their sharp knives. A raven from the Eyrie came in at midday, fat with its own confidence, carried 2 letters. One was from Maester Coleman, written in a hand that preferred caution. The other was from Robin Arryn, and its letters stood like boys trying to be taller than they were. Sansa read Coleman's first. He wrote that the health of the Lord of the Eyrie was somewhat improved in appetite, which might mean he had eaten a piece of cheese and wanted another, and that the boy slept ill and fearfully and woke talking of falling. He wrote that Lord Royce had done as he could in the face of a household that had learned to bow not to necessity but to the behavior of a spoiled boy. He wrote that Royce would accompany the knights who rode north and would seek his lady's counsel the moment his mount shook Winterfell snow from its mane. She read Robin's letter after, standing under the window where the light was best, and would forgive a boy more than a lamp would. He said he had heard she had married, and he hoped, You are glad. He asked whether it would be all right to send his falconer's boy north in the spring to see if the eagles in the cliffs near the Long Lake were the sort he had been told they were. He wrote that the mushrooms had been particularly good lately, and that it snowed sometimes at the Eyrie even when it did not snow anywhere else. He wrote that the bannermen relied on him to be very stern, and that he had been stern for an entire morning and had not even had to lie down. Sansa touched the words with the side of her little finger and asked for wax. "Tell him we are glad," she whispered to Davos, who heard what was required and discerned what should be left unsaid. "Tell him the eagles are proud enough to ignore anyone who isn't patient. Tell him his sternness is famous here, and that the bannermen will tell their children of it if he keeps it up for an entire week. Tell Coleman we want Royce's men at the Bloody Gate, and we want Royce's judgment about how many he can spare without risking a boy in a fit." "And Littlefinger?" Davos asked, because he had learned to say the name softly so that the man never had cause to smile just because he had been mentioned. "He will insert himself," Sansa said. "That is his skill. The letters he sends we will read. The letters he takes we will ignore." Littlefinger came in that afternoon, as if she had conjured him with the thought. He did not enter as a man enters a place where he works. He entered as a man enters a room where he would like to own the furniture and is trying to judge whether the chairs will suit him. He bowed an excellent bow and rose from it as if the act had mended something in his spine. "I've had word from the Fingers," he said, as if it were kindness to share something that lay in the geography of his name. "The sea is full of ships that don't know where they are going yet. It's a sign. The world is waiting." "The sea never knows where it is going," Davos said cheerfully, saving Sansa the labor of answering. "It knows only where it has been and whether it would like to go there again. The ships are men's business." Littlefinger turned his head to Sansa with a look that said he was delighted to have competition that he believed would exhaust itself before it reached the end of the game. "And men," he murmured, "do not like to wait. You've set them to it. You'll need to give them bread that isn't only their supper. Give them a story. Give them an enemy they can see and pretend to hate as if the hate were not borrowed for the day." "We have an enemy," Sansa said. "She sits in a chair that cuts anyone who tries to sit there after her." His mouth twitched. "I mean a nearer enemy, a nearer story." She could have told him about the 2 sacks and the man and the child and the boots. She did not. It was not his story to carry. "We will write," she said. "We will not invent. You will be a good queen," he observed, "even if you do not let anyone call you that." "I don't let anyone call me what I don't believe I am," she said, and his eyes brightened an almost imperceptible amount at the double hinge in that reply. It gave him a small shape to build a trap around. She would know it by the smell if he did. When he was gone, Davos made a motion with his hand as if he would scrub it on the air. "He's like fat on the surface of stew," he said. "He makes it seem richer. You want to skim him away and save it for later. Only if you turn your back on the pot. He'll keep it from boiling over and you can't argue with a thing done that needed doing. He thinks himself the one who knows the small writing at the bottom of every promise," Sansa said. "He never reads the writing on the walls." Jon had said little while Littlefinger was speaking because Jon had nothing to say that would not either give a man like that something to use or descend into the sort of plain discourtesy that breaks floors as easily as it cracks heads. When the door closed behind Peter Baelish, Jon approached the table. He set a finger on the map and moved down the King's Road, through the neck over the twins. He didn't like letting his finger linger there. He took it away quickly. He moved across the Green Fork to Riverrun and then to the Gold Road and back to the map's edge. "We're going to need to ask for something we don't like to ask for," he said. Sansa waited. "Hostages," Jon said. "Not prisoners. Wards. Children. We'll call them the first word, we'll treat them as the second, and we'll be honest about the difference between the two. We'll bring them here and feed them and teach them to survive this winter, and we will make it clear their mothers will not sleep if they break their reasons for having been sent. The old way, not the brutal way. The North understands it better than the South does. Everyone understands their children," Sansa said. She put her finger where his had been and kept it there. But we choose who's to ask for, and we choose why. We don't ask for the sons of men who have nothing but sons. We don't ask for the daughters of women who have had to make daughters into field hands. We don't ask for heir and spare from the same house. We don't use fear as a lever. We use the promise of return, and we make it a promise we intend to keep. Davos nodded. "I'll write," he said, "and I'll write it so it leaves room for love to curl around it and make it look like common sense." He looked at Jon. "And you'll let me write the part about not being a wolf who eats the lambs he's given." Jon inclined his head and let a breath out between his teeth that would have been a laugh if laughter were not liable to bring the ceiling down when made in rooms where difficult words had just been placed. The King's Landing that late winter held a cold without snow. The air was sharp, mean as lemon without sugar. The red keep stones did not give their cold back when touched. They absorbed it and held it down and made rooms feel full of a silence that was not peace. The Queen stood on a balcony with the map below like a children's board game. But none of the pieces moved unless Qyburn moved them, and even then only as a representation, not as a fact. Qyburn read reports that came folded without crest. The sort of paper that meant to be burned as soon as the eyes were done with it. The sort of ink that made itself look expensive to justify what had been spent to put it on the paper. Merchants were moving north with goods and with gold disguised as goods. Some were honest. Most were not. A few were meant to be caught so that the ones who were not would not be. The Queen's face did not move. She did not ask for details because the details would be the first thing a servant would overhear if she asked. And she had learned that servants have a way of turning a detail into a story that men will later remember as truth. "Let them have their fish," she said, "and their cloth. Let the north grow fat on its own fear. It will make it sluggish." She put a black pebble over Winterfell and left it there for a count of 7. Then she moved it down to Moat Cailin and placed 3 white pebbles between them. "They're buying time," she said, echoing a conversation she was not party to. "Because some truths are big enough to be shared by enemies without being made less true. We'll buy something else. We'll buy rumors of White Harbor shipping grain to Lannisport. We'll buy confirmation of it. And then we'll buy the silence of the men who know better. We'll cut the legs out from under their patience." "And from where shall we buy the rumors?" Qyburn asked gently. "The same place you buy everything," she said. "By finding the man whose mother is ill. By telling him you can keep her alive or you can let her die. And then by keeping your word once and letting it slip the next, because certainty is a chair and men who sit in chairs can be toppled with less effort than men who have learned to stand." He nodded and made a note in a hand like a spider's practical web. He would need to find men whose mothers were ill in White Harbor. He would need to find a man in Old Town who had letters to write with a rose seal and coin to melt into a signet that meant nothing and everything. He would need to find a way to ensure that any man who took his coin died quietly before he could be asked to explain why his purse was heavy in Winterfell when his pockets had been empty in the Reach. Jaime came in while Qyburn was still arranging the small black pebbles on the riverlands to rot to their proper positions. He had the look of a man who has learned to wear his armor as if it were not metal but habit. He looked at the pebbles without moving and then at Cersei without asking. His hair had gone the color of straw that has been bleached not by work but by a sun that no longer believes in men. His missing hand did not announce itself until he moved, and then it declared, as always, a history no one wanted to tell to them again in a voice that had grown tiresome even to itself. "We insulted the phrase in our last letter," he said mildly, which meant that the letter had said something necessary. "They don't notice the sort of insult that matters, and they'll remember the sort that doesn't. They'll make something of it and then ask us to fix the thing they broke. In the meantime, Raventree is a thorn left to grow. The Blackwoods burn books to keep warm. They have less need of them than we do. But burning a book makes a man feel like a priest. It's an indulgence." "You sound like a man who has made peace with losing something repeatedly," Cersei said. "It's a condition I do not intend to share." Jaime smiled a little. "I sound like a man who has stopped pretending to be a better man than he is to keep a conversation from moving forward." "Are you advising me to move forward?" she asked, half amused. "You can't bring an army to the north in winter. You can send your coins and your tongues, and they walk faster. And you can make a list of those who answered quickly and those who answered too carefully, he said. You can decide which sort of traitor you prefer. The North will never be ours. But we can decide whose North it will most certainly not be, and we can make that not be-ness cost them more than it costs us. She looked at his face as if it were a book she had read many times and had come to out of habit in the same way one reaches for a cup without looking. She could still be surprised by what was in it. That annoyed her. You speak as if you do not expect to be at my side for this. I expect to be where I can do most good, he said. To whom? She asked with genuine curiosity. He didn't answer. Qyburn had the grace to become busy with the map. Back in Winterfell, Jon had taken a group of young men out beyond the walls to where the snow lay in a low valley and the wind behaved there as if it had been taught manners. He set them to cutting a series of narrow lines with their shovels to show them how a man can make a virtue out of having too few men by letting the ground do half the work. Every drift has a spine, he said. You find it, you set the weight of that spine against itself. It holds. The men did not immediately understand how a line of snow could be a weapon. They understood better when he had them lie on their backs in the trough they had cut and asked the others to roll a barrel along the top. The barrel did not tip. The men in the trough were not crushed. So it is with battles, Jon said. You find the part of the enemy that will turn against the other parts when pushed. You make your troughs and you wait. They went back with their faces reddened and their eyes watering not from cold now so much as from the wind's small kindness. Tormund met them at the gate and told them a story about a boy who had tried to fight the wind, and the wind had been so pleased by the challenge that it fought him all day. But then the wind grew bored and went away, and the boy discovered he had been fighting his own breath against his scarf. The men laughed because if they did not laugh, they would have had to call it a parable. In the mid-afternoon, a girl came from the bear with a message that had not been written down. She stood with Lyanna Mormont as if they were both angles cut from the same piece of hard wood. The girl's hair had been cut close to her skull to keep it from freezing wet against her neck. She wore a cloak that had once been her brother's and now was hers because her brother was dead. She said, "We've seen men on the shore. Their ships are too far for us to know the color of their sails. But the men carry notched spears and their boots are wrong for snow, and there are too many of them to be a fishing party." "Raiders," Davos said. "Or worse." "Worse is always a comfort to imagine," Lyanna said. "Practically, they'll steal what there is to steal, and we have become too good at hiding what's worth taking. Still, they'll try to take the cattle because cattle walk themselves to the shore and don't complain until they're on the ship. We'll need to put the cattle somewhere a man can't easily climb. We've broken enough stone to build 2 new walls," Jon said. "Use one to build mounds. Drive the beasts atop them and balance the paths with logs that a cow can learn in a day and a man with a shield can't walk without falling. Station archers in the trees. Freemen if they'll go. They'll see better through the needled branches." Lyanna nodded as if she were giving herself orders. The girl from Bear Island looked at Sansa, not to ask permission, but to measure whether the words left in the room were words she could carry back and repeat without being told she had carried the wrong ones. Sansa said, "Tell your aunt this. If they are Greyjoys, remember that their pride is made of salt. If they are Lannisters' friends, remember their pride is made of gold. Either way, don't flatter them. Pride made of salt dissolves when it is not admired. Pride made of gold becomes heavy when praise is withheld." "They are not Greyjoys," the girl said. "We know the sound of a nail driven into a hull that should not be holding a sea, and we know the songs men sing when they think they are alone. These do not sing. They count." "Then they belong to a counting house," Davos said, more to himself than to anyone else, "which means they can be made to lose count." Sansa sent the girl to the kitchen for food to carry back in a leather bag. She put into the bag 3 biscuits she had baked herself when she had woken before the cook, as she did on mornings when sleep had decided to take her elsewhere. Lyanna watched the putting in of those biscuits with a solemnity that made Sansa want to laugh and to cry at the same time. She did neither. The wind sharpened again at dusk, going from something that moved hair off the face to something that reached into sleeves with cold fingers. Sansa found Jon again near the Godwood. as if some part of her day always required her to be measured against that tree whether or not she meant to go and touch it. Ghost lay near the root with his head on his paws and his eyes closed, which for him meant a level of comfort most men never achieved even in their own beds. "My mother would have had something to say about the day," Sansa said. "She would have disapproved of at least 3 of the decisions we made, and then sat up until midnight mending the rips those decisions left, as if she had always been part of the making." "Your mother would have liked Davos," Jon said. "He doesn't claim to be more than he is. She would have liked him because he tells the truth and because he keeps his fingernails clean," Sansa said, surprising herself into a small smile that had his presence's quiet humor to blame for it. She was never unkind to a man whose hands knew work. She was unkind to men who believed they were clever because they knew how to keep their hands soft. "Littlefinger keeps his hands soft," Jon said carefully. "He keeps the softest part of himself where he can best use it," Sansa said, and then she stopped because she had no wish to walk any further toward the thought behind those words. "He will try to separate us. It is the game he knows. When he sees 2 stones that make an arch, his first thought is to pry one away to see what falls. We will not give him a crack to press his fingers into," Jon said. "We will not argue where he can hear us. We will not keep secrets from one another about matters that can be used like knives." "Agreed," Sansa said. "And if we disagree, we will disagree here." She glanced up at the red, unblinking eyes. "Where the gods cannot be bribed to repeat what they saw." They stood for a time with their breaths turning to pale streamers that flowed upward and vanished. Some of the people who watched them from the path nodded to themselves, thinking it good that the 2 who had bound the house were seen here together doing no more than sharing the cold. That night, Sansa sat with a ledger and read the columns aloud to Davos in the same way her mother had once read prayers beside a bed. When there was a number that did not match the number it had been the night before, she paused, and Davos found the place where the line had shifted and made a mark so that the man who came the next morning would see the place where his memory wanted to argue with what the ink showed. She went to bed with the heavy peace of a woman who had done the plain thing well. Jon went to the yard again by habit and found 2 of his older soldiers arguing about whether the snow would hold a man's weight along the east wall. He didn't tell them to stop. He watched, and when one of them threw himself into the drift and sank up to his chest, he walked to him and offered a hand and pulled. When the man was up, he took the other by the shoulder. "Do your arguing with a rope tied round your waist next time," he said. "You've wives who would kill me if I let you do your stupid dying here." He slept after that, and if his dreams contained the faces of men he had buried, they also contained the face of a girl with her feet wrapped in his boots who did not cry when made to do what would save her. A messenger from the Dreadfort ruins came gray with ash the next day and carried the stubborn smell of a fire that had been kept down with snow. He reported no men being set there again. The wolves had made dens where human rooms had been, and the wolves did not fear men as much as they had once feared other wolves. Sansa told the messenger to take a new scarf and a bowl of stew and to sit near the fire until he had remembered that he had one. The messenger wept once into the stew and then stopped. It was a good stew and he did not want to insult it. At midday, a small knot of men from White Harbor arrived with carts that had been balanced so cleverly that 3 boys could pull them when 8 could not. They had brought smoked fish and sweet butter sealed in leather and cut with salt to keep it honest. And along with those things they had brought the skills that made the bringing possible. They showed the men of Winterfell how to oil the axles so that the cold would not eat at the wood. They showed the women how to fold cloth around a loaf so the loaf did not come back wet with its own heat. In exchange, Winterfell showed them where the stones lay that did not need lifting but needed simply to be turned so their flattest face became a path. The first of the Vale Knights came 2 days later. Royce's cloak announced him before his horse did. He had left a portion of his men at the Bloody Gate, as Sansa had requested, and brought the rest himself because he did not trust a messenger with gestures that needed to be made with his body. He dismounted without grunting, which was both habit and pride. He went to one knee without splendor and without hurry, and then he stood and did not kneel again because kneeling had done the work it was required to do and it was time to get on with other work that needed standing. "The boy eats," he said by way of greeting. And in that one line Sansa could smell the stables and the stringy chicken, and the herbs Coleman had a fondness for even when he should have been sparing of them. He thinks himself stern. He wrote you a letter. He forbade me to read it and then asked me to read it to be sure it said what he meant. I did not read it. He has to learn that sometimes the only way to keep a man from deciding things for you is to accept the discomfort of not knowing how badly you've done. Your judgment is what I asked for, Sansa said, and the steadiness in her voice had less effort now than it had in the hall when the lords had still been deciding whether to be pleased or to be seen to be displeased in the way their fathers had taught them. How many men can we take without exposing your boy to a danger he cannot define? As long as he believes he has sent too many, he will be content, Royce said. So I will give him that contentment. 200 now, 50 every week after with the thaw, if the thaw comes. 30 at the least. Men who can make their own tents and not complain when they have to sleep under a tree without one. And Littlefinger? Jon asked, because he needed to hear what Royce would say without any of his own suspicion coloring the answers. He has the luck of men who make weather for themselves and then pretend surprise when it rains in their favor, Royce said dryly. I have told him I would sooner keep my eyes lifted toward what the sky is doing than lower them to see whether he is smiling. He will be useful until he is not. When that happens, he will be fatal for someone or other. Let us hope it is not for you. We know how he works, Sansa said. I learned how he works serving boys who wanted to be men and men who wanted to go on being boys, Royce said. He makes them feel they are already what they want to be. It is a powerful drug. He has given it up for you. His eyes softened on Sansa as a father's do when he has decided to speak a thing he might have no right to. Do not take it, my lady. Do not take it, even when tiredness asks you to. I've already decided to be whatever I wake as, Sansa said. It's the only kind of certainty I can afford. Royce nodded, as if a stone he had been carrying had moved to a more comfortable spot against his ribs. Then we'll send our boys to you, and they'll come back ready to tell other boys that the North knows what it's doing. They ate well that night because the men who bring horses bring appetites that remind kitchens what kitchen work is for. The knights told stories of the road, of the way the neck seemed to move under men who hadn't learned how to stand on it without being swallowed. They laughed without mocking when free folk mimed how those men had lifted their legs high like cranes and cursed the ground for the crime of being water. They learned to step sideways when a woman with a bucket ran through the hall with a look in her eye that said the hall would be clean again when she had finished whether it wanted to be or not. They sang a song about a boar and its unfortunate man, and the refrain was quickly changed by Winterfell's women to be about a woman and her unfortunate boar. The Vale men couldn't tell if they were the butt of it. They decided to be flattered instead. Another letter came from the Reach. It was not the same steward's hand as before. This one wrote like a man whose future was counted in meals rather than months. He begged not for coin but for surety. Sansa sent him a line that said only, "We do not know where you lay your head, but if you fill 3 wagons with what your lord will not miss and send them north with men whose faces will not be remembered, we will send you 3 back with tools you can sell for more grain than this season will grow. Make sure you are not seen. If you are seen, burn the grain before you deliver it to your lord's steward. Fire will feed more of you than a whip." She sent the letter with a raven that had once belonged to a lady of House Tyrell. Its feathers had a pale fringe no black bird born here had. She watched it take the sky and hoped it would keep to the clouds when it could, because men look less often to the gray for harbingers. The first of the saboteurs came at last when everyone had learned almost to be bored of waiting for men who mean harm and carry their harm like a lantern they believe no one can see. He came with tar. He rolled it in and tucked it under an arm as if it were cheese to be cut into a meal. He set a small fire near the door of a storehouse and then another on the far side where no one would see until the wood had decided to make a noise about what was being done to it. He was quick and clever and had come within the job's breadth of finishing it when Ghost stepped out from behind a sleigh and showed him what a thing looks like when it moves as if it had never bothered to learn how not to be a shadow. The man froze as men do when the picture before them asks their bodies to become stones and the body tries to imagine itself into being part of the road. Ghost loped forward and put his paw on the man's chest and pressed until the breath left him. Jon arrived without a word. He took the tar and set it down and stamped out the small fires with the heel of his hand where they had caught on the straw, ignoring the pain as one ignores a cousin's cutting remark at a table with guests present. He pulled the man up by the front of his cloak. "I can throw you to the hall and let them tear you to pieces," he said quietly. "I can hang you inside the walls and tell the children not to look, and they will look, and they will remember the shape your legs made in the air. Or I can tell you you're going to die in spring as slowly as mud melts. I can keep you here and feed you and question you, and you will have to live with knowing you tried and failed, and the Lannisters don't reward failure. Not in men they don't know by name." He tipped the man's head back. "Or I can send you home with a story that will get you paid and keep you alive long enough to try again. I can send you home with a story that burns hotter than the tar in your hands. I can tell you what to tell the men who sent you." The man's eyes flickered the way a man's eyes do when he was going to say, "What do you want?" and then decides not to waste breath on words the other and clearly already has answers to. "You'll go back and tell them that we don't have stores," Jon said. "You'll tell them the storehouses are half empty and that the grain carts that came in went out again almost immediately, toward the west. You'll tell them to send their men to the rills and the bar rollins if they want to make a difference, because their torches will make a better show against the lower walls. The storehouses here," he jerked the man's head toward the buildings the man had tried to set alight, "are kept closed because the grain wasn't worth keeping. And if they don't believe me," the man managed, "then you will tell them the other story," Davos said, stepping forward. He had been there, watching as he did when a lesson needed to be learned, and it would save everyone time for the learner not to know he was attending school. "You'll tell them that you found a storehouse full to the rafters with bannermen eating honey from the comb and sugar from the cane, and that the men had oil in their hair and smiles on their faces, and they said the queen was a fool. You'll make it large and loud and wrong, and then they'll cut your pay because they won't want to pay you to lie to them. You don't want that. Best to keep the first story, the one with mud in it." "What do I get?" the man asked, because even men with better futures than his ask that when they can. "You get to keep your life," Sansa said. She had come at Davos' gesture and stood a little behind Jon, where she could see the man's eyes and perhaps, if she were lucky, let her stillness pull the lie out of him the way one pulls a thorn out of a child's foot. "And a coat, because you'll need it to walk home and we won't have you die like an idiot in a ditch. And a packet of dried meat. And a name you can sell to the next man to get yourself hired again. Sell him the name of the guard who spotted you if you like. The guard is ready to have his name sold. We'll watch how many times the name gets back to us, and we'll see how fast news travels. We'll use you to learn what we need to know." The man looked at her then as if he had never seen a woman before, or as if the women he had seen had been asked to be something else. He nodded. Davos gave him the coat himself. The man took it with the old, respectful movements of a poor person accepting a gift and left, walking carefully as if the ground were trying to decide whether or not it would hold him. That night, Jon and Sansa sat together as they now often did when the fire in the small room had already burned down once and had been built again by hands that did not want the night to end without this additional warmth. They did not sit close enough to be thought to be making a point. They sat close enough to know the other was there when the other drew breath to speak. The talk was mostly of small things, the way the men from the Vale drank their beer like it did not offend them the way the Northern Ale offended them, the way a child had tried to tie a ribbon around Ghost's tail, and how Ghost had stood as if he had been a tree while the ribbon was tied, and then had slipped his tail out as soon as the child's head was turned. They spoke of Wolken's worry about the fever, and then his embarrassment when it turned out to be only the old winter cough. They spoke of the raven from the Reach again, and how best to write men who would not be able to keep letters safe. Finally Sansa said, because she had to say something and did not wish to say the thing she was thinking, "When we were little and the summer felt like it would never end, Arya used to cut her hair and say that winter had arrived on her head, and she would run around like she had been changed by a season in an afternoon. She always did the work of a season in an afternoon," Jon said, smiling in a way that made the lamps seem to notice. "She would arrive in a room as if the room had been waiting to be a different room, and when she left, it had become that other room. I think of her sometimes. I hope she is alive enough to disapprove of everything we are doing." Sansa laughed at that softly and then, very quickly, stopped, because memory is a kind of wall that keeps you warm until you lean against it and the cold on the other side finds a seam. "I hope she is alive," she said. "She is," Jon said, not because he knew, but because some truths must occasionally be declared by fiat if a house is to stand. She could have told him then about a rumor she had heard of a girl at an inn near the Trident who had killed 3 men in a night because they had tried to take something that did not belong to them. She did not tell him because rumors are for kitchens, and this room needed to be kept free of them to make space for counsel and silence. When she rose, it was with the pride of a woman who will not let a long day fold her into a shape she did not choose. "Tomorrow the cobblers are in the small hall," she said. "If you want boots, come then. They'll fit your foot while it's on you. They don't trust men who measure and send out for sizes." "My feet are never what they were," Jon said. "None of us are," Sansa said. "Good night." He watched her go and thought of the old gods and their blank white faces. He wondered if they were amused or indifferent. He suspected they were something else entirely, something like the weather which does not have room for amusements. He slept without seeing the faces of his men or his enemies. His dreams were of the small insults the day inflicts that only reveal their size when one wakes and sees the bruise they have left. Spring did not come. It never does when small folk and lords alike begin to speak of it as if it were a guest already on the road. What came was a storm that lasted 3 days and left the world in a silence that was almost holy. In that silence, Sansa stood in the hall and watched the drip from the roof tip into a bucket. And when the bucket filled, her hands did not let someone else carry it. She lifted it and poured it into the barrel, and then she set it back. She did this twice, and then someone else took it, knowing that if she did it once, she had done enough to make it not a story someone could use against her later. After the storm, a woman from the rills came into Winterfell with a basket of woven willow under her cloak. She set it on the table before Sansa with both hands and looked as if she had done something dreadful and was willing to be punished for it. Sansa lifted the cloth and found a heap of wooden tokens cut with little notches along their edges. There were dozens of them, each unique. Sansa looked up with a question in her face. "We use them for children," the woman said, "when they cannot stay to hear the list of things they must do." Here she smiled with a humor that made the cold notice and nod. "They carry these instead. The notches are for what's to be done. When they finish a notch, they tie a thread to it. At the end of the day, they carry the threads to their mothers, and their mothers count the threads. We keep the tokens in a bin and hand them out at dawn, and none are lost because no child would dare lose a day once it has been counted." She pushed the basket forward. "A gift." Sansa took a token and thumbed the notches. "We'll give them to the men at the gate," she said. "They'll think it foolish until the first time they forget a thing and the token reminds them. Then they'll fight each other to have the best ones in their pockets." The woman laughed and collected the threads that had fallen loose in the basket and braided them together absent-mindedly. Sansa watched and learned the movement so she could teach it later. The first wagons from the Reach arrived at last, hidden among 3 that had turned back in fear and burned their load rather than be found with it on a road that had grown hostile to everything that could be sold at a loss. The men driving the wagons had a look Sansa recognized. The look of men who have done a foolishly brave thing and succeeded and are now terrified at the certainty that they will be asked to do it again because success looks so much like ease to men who were not present for the work. She instructed that their names not be written down and that they be given food and a place to sleep away from the eyes of men who report. She asked Davos to carry a portion of the grain to White Harbor's people and to say nothing when doing it. When Davos cocked an eye at her, she said, "Let Manderley discover he's been repaid before he asked. Let him write me not a letter of gratitude but a letter of irritation. So the men who watch his correspondence will learn nothing." "You tie knots," Davos said. "That will keep a boat safe and look like accidents to any man trying to untie them. The sea teaches such lessons," she said, acknowledging the compliment and the risk both. In the 3rd week after the binding, a man made of elbows and bleak humor walked into the great hall at midday with 3 other men in his shadow. He said no greeting of note. He stood before the table and pushed back his hood. His hair was gray in streaks like a winter sky. His clothing had been good once and then had been something else on the road for a long time. He watched Sansa without smiling, and then he watched Jon. And when he watched Jon, his mouth quirked the way a man's mouth does when it remembers a child grown and is surprised not to be surprised. "Slim Reed," Davos said under his breath. By every god and by none, he's of the neck. Howland Reed's kin by line if not by reputation. The man had brought with him the peat smell of bogs and the patience of water whose time cannot be measured by anyone who stands on dry land. He bowed a little, like a tree that trusts the wind not to snap it. Winterfell, he said. His voice the reed whistle sound of the next speech, light and narrow and not to be mocked unless one wanted to be later caught in a place where the ground only pretended to be ground until it swallowed you. Reed, Sansa said. She stood but did not step forward. These were men who liked to come the last 2 yards of a meeting themselves. Welcome. He glanced around as if the hall had been built by a dream his mother had once told him, and now the dream had a door wrong by a hand's breadth. We don't welcome easy, he said. We look, then we welcome. Your house is what it is. The words I carry will do as they do in it. Carry them, Jon said. Slim Reed touched 2 fingers to the side of his face in an odd, precise salute. The neck is yours for hiding and walking, he said. If you walk the way I'll show you. Men are coming to it who think they can learn it with maps. They'll be dead before the ink dries. But if you'll have my men, and they'll be fed and treated as folk, not as men who live off crawlers and don't know how to speak. You'll find the neck will cheerfully kill those who try to kill you. There's a price. Peace after. No cleverness. No knights riding in to see the trick and to tell the story at a table far away. You'll do as we say in the Marsh and we'll do as you say everywhere else. And what do you want in return? Sansa asked. Besides not being told your own business in the place that is literally your world. Cheese, Slim Reed said, without shifting his expression in the least. Then, and the love of those with whom we share the land, and who forget us when it suits them. But we'll begin with cheese. You shall have it, Sansa said, so struck with the neatness of the man's request that she wanted to reach for his hands and squeeze them the way she did when she liked a joke more than she had expected to. And the rest? The rest will come when the neck has done work for you, Slim Reed said. The men who want to buy you are not patient. The men who are trying to kill you with kindness are more dangerous. We'll pull their wagons in just far enough and then make their horses remember how much they hate to move when the ground is giving under them. We'll set your enemies thinking you hired the weather. They'll be angry enough at the sky that they'll forget to be angry at you. Jon inclined his head as if he had been shown some aspect of his own home he had forgotten existed. He had loved the neck as a younger man, not because of any beauty in it that a song could hold, but because it refused to be what anyone needed it to be who did not deserve its secrets. We will have your men, he said. Slim Reed turned to Sansa with a different softness than he had shown Jon. It was the softness a man grants a woman who can be trusted to know how to use it against him if she likes, but who will not. There's another thing, he said. News in the Marsh moves like light through a reed mat. Slow, but it comes if you stand long enough. There are men who speak of a gold lion's eyes watching the twins with a staring so fierce that it should have set the bridge on fire. There are women taking water where they shouldn't have to because their men have been dragged away to be counted. There are children being told not to look when the men are counted, and their mothers tell them to look anyway so that they can confirm the number of men who left and the number who returned. This counting is of interest. It is, Sansa said. She wanted to say more. She wanted to ask if he had heard other names, names that made her bones itch with memory. She did not ask. Slim Reed smiled as if she had when she did not and inclined his head the degree a whisper nod requires. We'll set that cheese on a cart, he said, and we'll see how far it can roll before the dirt eats the wheel. Then we'll bring you what we've learned. The men he had brought drank with the free folk as easily as if they had all come from the same marsh. The hall took on for an hour a texture Sansa liked very much. People whose geographies did not crave to dominate each other seated at a common table, making the shared motion of raising a bowl to a mouth and setting the empty bowl down again. It was happy in a way that was not expensive. So, Davos said later with a quirk of his mouth, you have the neck, the Vale, the Bear, White Harbor, and boys who will tie ribbons on a wolf if he lets them. You have men carrying lies for you and telling larger truths. You have children whose names in your ledger matter more than the names on those letters you send. You have a house that is beginning to believe it is once again a house. We will still have to bleed to keep it, Jon said. We will lose men who could have lived old. Yes, Davos said, but it matters that they die for a plan and not for someone's ease. The old gods, with apologies to their faces, help those who mean the thing they say because it is always easier to carry a meaning than a performance. Sansa took the token she had kept in her pocket since the woman from the Rills had given her the basket and ran her thumb over the notches. The day has done its tasks, she said. There are more tomorrow. We will do them. A raven came in the evening with a piece of parchment that was as fine as if a king's purse had paid for it and as dirty as if it had been pulled through a chimney. The seal was the Lannister lion's head, stamped deep. Sansa broke it and read under the lamp with hands that did not shake because the shaking had already happened months ago, and she had put it away into a ledger under the column labeled Costs, where it could not steal her attention every time a wind changed. The letter was brief. The Queen wrote that if the North intended to stand and pretend to be a thing it was not, the Crown would consider its obligations ended. The Crown would send no troops should White Walkers march, an old jest poorly used, meant to bite. The Crown would not protect northern ships in southern waters. The Crown would expect no tithe on the next year's harvest. It would expect instead a recognition of what it would take. She is testing the balance, Davos said. She's saying plain that she is no longer their queen and wants to see who says it back. Then we will not reply, Sansa said. The North already knows what it is. We do not need to teach a queen how to count. She set the letter in the fire. The lion's head went black along its edges, then sank into itself and was nothing but an odd shape among embers, and then not even that. They did not sleep well that night. The hall's quiet revived all the noises the day had asked perhaps a bit too sternly to be quieted. Even Ghost was alert, his head lifting at sounds the men could not hear. Jon lay on his back and watched the beams, counting them as if they were the notches on the token Sansa carried. He thought of 1,000 small roads leading from Winterfell to paths he had walked before and to paths he had not. He thought of a child with her feet wrapped in his boots. He thought of Arya running with a strand of ribbon in her fingers and Ghost's tail in front of her like a white rope she had been told not to pull. In the morning, there was no time to be tired. Royce's men were to go out to set markers on the road for the small parties that would leave each week to return to the Vale with more news and to bring back men as the weather allowed. The markers were made of stone and wood and set low to the ground so they would not offend the men who look for tall things to knock over. Slim Reed's men took to them, moving one here and one there because their steps could feel where the ground would hold and where it would not. They did not ask permission to shift the work of men they had only just met. They simply did it and then grinned with their eyes when a Vale man stepped in mud where they had not. Sansa stood in the yard and saw that it was beginning. The thing they had said would begin, and she felt the peculiar combination of dread and excitement that arrives just before a play begins when the audience has not yet been given the first line, but is capable of making up an entire story to fill the space if the actors don't hurry. She was glad then for Davos's presence at her shoulder. "It won't be glorious," he said, as if he had heard the part of her that was tempted by the idea of glory even as she disciplined herself to ignore it. "It will be slow and stupid with moments of clean, hard light." "Moments are enough," she said. At noon, a small boy fell into the well. He fell half the way down and caught on a shelf of ice that had formed where the rope had dripped. He clung and cried with a sound so furious at being unable to save itself that men laid their hands on the stones and then realized there was nothing their hands could do. Tormund threaded himself down like a man falling asleep and awake again in the same breath. He put the boy across his shoulders and climbed with a grace no hall would ever have expected of a man with his beard and his belly. He came up clean and the hall cheered with relief, and then he looked around as if he were waiting for something else to demand him, and when it did not, he shrugged and carried the boy to where he could be given to his mother, who had stayed back with her hands clenched to keep herself from trying to do the thing that could not be done. "Put that in the story." Davos waved at no one in particular and at all of them. "Put that in tomorrow's story when men are feeling mean about life. A man went down a well and came up with a boy alive." By evening, Royce had sent the first of his riders to the Eyrie with his list and his count. Slim Reed had sent a man to the neck with a wheel of cheese in a rucksack that would not look like a rucksack if anyone stared at it, because the men who stare at things instead of trying to touch them do not see what they think they see. The White Harbor men had taken the measure of the path sto. Ness and pronounced themselves satisfied, which meant they had found at least 3 things they wanted to tell their lord had been done wrong. The girl from Bear Island had returned to report that the men on the shore had gone away without finding what they had wanted to take. She had brought back a string of shells to give to the child whose feet had been wrapped in John's boots. The child accepted the shells with a gravity that made the bear girl grin and elbow Lyanna, who did not grin but allowed the elbow to encounter her without cutting it off at the joint with a glare. Littlefinger sent a gift, a box of dyed ribbons, imported from a city he did not name because naming it would have told on him in ways the box could not. The card said, "To bind what must be remembered." Sansa accepted the box and told the servant who brought it to send no message back, and then she went to the storeroom and placed the ribbons on a shelf where children might find them and play with them, and she did not tell anyone where she had placed them so that later, when Littlefinger asked her whether she had liked them, she could say with fresh truth that she had no idea where they had ended up and might he check with the steward. Night fell again. They had come to count their days by the moments when the light broke and when it left, and by the measure of the work done between these two, where one could count the threads tied to tokens and the bowls scraped clean and the feet that had stayed warm because the boots had been fitted to them in a small hall where men had laughed at the jokes of the cobblers and then been glad they had paid more for good leather. Jon went to the crypt again because he needed sometimes to stand in the company of stone. He stood before Ned Stark and thought that the face carved there was honest in ways men's faces rarely can be. It did not pretend to be warm. It did not try to be fair. It was solid, and being solid offered its own kind of comfort. He spoke aloud because the crypt felt false if one used it only to think. "We're doing it," he said. "I don't know if we're doing it right, but we're doing it, and if it fails it won't be because we asked men to give us their days and then toss their days aside the way the South does when it decides the season has a better use for itself than feeding the hungry." When he came up, Sansa was waiting again in the courtyard where the stars had learned to hide behind the clouds. She had a scarf wound over her hair and another under her chin. She did not look cold. She looked like the night had placed her there as part of its arrangement of things. "Reed told me something I did not want to hear," she said without preface. "Go on," he said. "He said that there are men counting lives at the twins with their lips moving," she said. "He said he would tell us more when the cheese arrived and they had eaten it." She almost smiled at the absurdity and then let the almost go. "Counting men means sending men. I'll have to write to them. I hate that." "As do I," Jon said. "So we'll write," she said. They stood a while longer. The wind made the flag snap high on the wall, and for a brief, foolish second Sansa thought she saw her father's face in it. And then she gave herself the mercy of deciding she simply saw cloth. They went in. The fire had been built anew. The hall was full of men who had realized that warmth could be a discipline as well as a comfort. They ate and they drank and they told stories of the weather. They had to. The weather was the only enemy they could insult without fear of being later asked to apologize. And the next morning began, as mornings do, not with trumpets but with a small boy holding a token with the wrong notches cut into it and Davos teaching him how to sand a wooden disc until the mistake was no longer the first thing the eye saw. In such ways does a house begin to learn its own story before sending its people out to be written into someone else's. The rasp of sand on wood made a soft, stubborn music, and the boy's tongue, which had found its concentration place between his teeth, made a small pink flag he forgot was there. Davos watched the circle blur into a truer circle and decided the morning had begun properly. The kitchen's first smoke found the rafters and took its time deciding how to settle. The stableyard sent in the smell of warmed hay and wet leather, and somewhere a dog launched 3 decisive barks at a rooster that chose wisdom and left the argument. Sansa moved along the edge of the work with the hood of her cloak thrown back far enough to make her breath show. She paused by the boy and touched the token after he finished, not to approve, simply to map its new edges with her thumb so her hand would remember the size of the day. Jon, already half snow by habit and by the path he'd taken to the gate and back, came in on the small wind the door admitted and shut with care. He shook his hair once, as a man born to winter learns to do. The beads of melt flung off and died on the flagstones without anyone needing to sweep them. A horn sounded in the yard, 2 notes, one longer than the other, the kind that said, "Guests who are not enemies and not yet friends." Men rose without clatter, and attention went to the door as naturally as flame goes to a wick. The first figure through was massive, where winter had found a body with no fat to spare and built strength where it could. A greatcoat rimed along the hem made a crackle as it moved. Beside that bulk came a younger man with careful, earnest eyes and a cloak that wanted to catch on everything in the room. Behind them, a horse stamped outside the threshold with the offended dignity of an animal that had been stopped just short of the warm. Brienne of Tarth, snow-salted and square-shouldered and faultlessly direct, took 3 steps into the hall and bowed her head to Sansa with a carefulness that made the act seem new and therefore meaningful. Podrick Payne bobbed a bow and nearly tangled himself in his own cloak strap. He freed it with a small apology that softened the faces of 3 women standing with trenchers and made one of them whisper, "Sweetling," to the cook. "My lady," Brienne said. That was what she called Sansa and what she would call her even if the hall demanded other words. Her voice carried over the room not by force but by clarity. "We rode when the pass opened. Lord Royce's men were on your road. He told us he'd left messages. We'd not wait on messages." "You never did," Sansa said, warmth entering her tone like color returning to a hand that has been warmed beside a brazier. The sight of Brienne always brought 2 girls to mind, the girl she had been and the girl Brienne had never been permitted to be. She stepped closer and took Brienne's forearm first, because the grip there soothed a soldier's vigilance better than any embrace might. Then she leaned in and kissed the air beside Brienne's cheek, a courtly ghost of courtesy that once would have been all she had to offer and now stood as decoration over something bone-deep. "Welcome home." Podrick caught Jon's gaze with an expression like a hound waiting to be told whether a thing is allowed. Jon smiled with his mouth and his eyes both. "Pod," he said. "My lord," Pod managed, then corrected himself in a flurry. My lord," and was so honest in his confusion that Jon laughed. A quiet sound a room takes note of because it is rare and never an indulgence. He clapped Podrick's shoulder, steadying him by touch as a father steadies a son who has decided to be too tall too quickly. Tormund arrived as if the horn had been his idea, all beard and appetite and the particular cheerfulness of men who have chosen not to let cleverness spoil a day. He stopped, struck as always by Brienne the way a man is struck by an oak that grew where he remembered only brush. His eyes brightened, and then he remembered this was a hall, and he was meant to be a man in a hall. He pulled his bare fur tighter and attempted an approximation of a bow. It looked like a large rock making room for a small stream. "Big woman," he said, awed, pleased, respectful as a boy properly taught to speak to a favorite aunt. "You found your way back." "The road was plowed," Brienne said, deadpan, which drew the strangled sound Davos made when rendered unexpectedly happy by another person's timing. They ate first, because Winterfell had decided that morning meals after long rides were not for talk. Bowls went down thick with oat and beef. Bread split to show the steam. Butter went in knife blade after knife blade and vanished with the sort of innocence only butter can summon in the face of war. Brienne ate like a woman who had endured inns that try to cheat with thin stew. Pod ate like a boy from a city who had learned to be grateful first and greedy never. After the bowls had been given their due and men had risen to take them away, after the benches had been pushed back to make room for boots and maps, Brienne stood near the great table and unrolled a piece of oilskin. Inside lay 3 messages, one clearly mangled by weather and read 10 times over, the others still neat. "From Riverrun," she said, placing the worst of the 3 under Sansa's eye. "From Ser Desmond of House Lannister. From a Blackwood captain who would not write his lord's name lest it add weight to the paper if it were dropped. The third's from a woman who sells baked apples 3 villages south of Derry. She didn't sign it at all. She writes the best hand." Sansa took the letters with the refrained hunger of someone who has seen information arrive as badly as it arrives well. She read in stillness. Jon watched the way her mouth made the smallest movement when she reached a word that pleased her, the tiniest tightening when a sentence tried to get away. He read over her shoulder when she offered the second letter without looking up. "Riverlords who do not know which lion commands the roar," Sansa said, summarizing for the room while her attention remained on the neatness of the apple seller's script. Small bands moving under big flags and then scurrying into barns like mice when anyone calls their names. Men counted in and counted out at the twins. Men gone where there are no roads. Not fry banners, she says. New cloth. Old faces. She set the letters down and lifted her eyes to Brienne's. And you? We skirted men who didn't want to admit they had orders, Brienne said. We saw two banners that did not fly together before this year. A golden lion on black, and a sunburst I did not recognize combined with something like a crown of grain. New painted shields, new songs badly learned. And we saw, she added more quietly, 3 gallows that had seen use recently on the East Bank. Names? Davos asked. They cut tongues as well as throats, Brienne said. The apple seller says a man counts faster when he does not have to write the names he counts. The gallows keep count for him. Jon's jaw tightened, but his hands did not. They curled once around the edge of the table and then flattened. We've word from Slim Reed, he said. The neck will take travelers it chooses and drown the rest. If men try to come up counting, the Marsh will count them back down. The Marsh has long memories, Brienne said. I saw men walking on water as a girl and decided I must be dreaming. I still think of it when I cross a floor that creaks. Useful things that do not make sense at first sight. Sansa moved a small carved wolf over the river on the map and let it sit where the ford shallowed. We'll write to Raventree and Seaguard, she said. Ask them to send bees when they can spare them. Bees, Tormund said. Workers who can swarm without making a show of it, Sansa said. Messengers who aren't asked for papers. Stings that make eyes water rather than bleed. They have people who can do it. And if they don't, they'll know someone who does. We'll send coin for their kitchens, not their armories. Brienne watched Sansa's face as she talked and felt again the peculiar mix of relief and dread the sight brought. She had sworn to protect this woman once, and that duty had ripened into a thing that resembled respect in her most private places, where doubt lives. Sansa was not the girl in a heavy fur cloak blinking in the wind. She was not the woman who wept in dark rooms and did not want the light to find her. She was not kind the way soft things are kind. She was kind the way stone is kind to the roots of a tree. Pod, Brienne said, and the young man straightened so quickly that his heel knocked the leg of the bench behind him, which took the knock in good humor. Show the Lord your list. Podrick produced a square of thick paper from inside his cloak. He had folded it so precisely that Sansa had to repress a smile. He handed it to Jon with both hands, as if it might run if not held by two. Jon unfolded it and found 3 columns of names, and beside each name a single word. Loyal, hungry, wavering, false, broke, grieving, cold. Every village we slept in, Pod said, flushing with the effort not to stumble. Ser Brienne told me not to ask questions that make a man lie. I asked for directions I didn't need, or for bread, or where to find the best horseshoeing. People want to talk to someone who isn't there to take something from them, my lord. They say things they don't know count. I remembered what they said when we left, and I put them down when she wasn't looking. I was looking, Brienne said without shame. He wrote neatly. It seemed unkind to interrupt. Jon read the names slowly, letting the sound of them build the rooms they belonged to. Sansa leaned in. 2 of the names wore the word grieving beside them. She tapped the paper. We will send these to thread and wool, she said. It's possible to grieve quieter when the hands have something to do. We'll send grain to this one, she added, pointing to a broke and hungry that belonged to the same place. And this man, this false, where was he? Near Fairmarket, Podrick said. He had too many teeth for how much he smiled. Good, Davos said. Make a small mark next to his name. If he replies to any letter with too much eagerness, we'll make a note of it. While the map filled with small stones and tokens and the bowl of wax took its turn on the brazier to keep seals from breaking, Littlefinger found his place in a shadow near the steward's table again, and the steward, who had learned the weight of his presence, set a second candle not to illuminate him, but to make the darkness behind him less of a stage. He watched Brienne with the blameless curiosity of a man who has never seen a mountain and has been told it is very tall. He watched Jon do the small favors that earn a room's loyalty without the room remembering to repay them. Moving a bench so an older man did not have to, lifting a child up to her mother's arm. He watched Sansa fold the Reach's map over the Riverlands map and then place both beneath the North's as if she were laying quilts over a sleeping child. He thought, not without pleasure, about what a mess someone would make of these three when they decided to stop seeing themselves as the last guard against chaos and began to trust one another beyond the useful. Brienne turned at length and found him. She did not frown. She tilted her head by a degree that sent the same message a frown might have delivered without involving the eyes. He inclined his in return, because a man who does not acknowledge that which must be acknowledged loses 2 turns later in a game he intended to win. He moved from his shadow and came nearer, placing himself where Sansa had to see him if she looked up, and not in her path if she did not. "You've brought us something," he said to Brienne genially, as if it were a compliment to be spoken of in the general, as if he had any right to be part of this circle. "Several somethings." "I brought what I could carry," Brienne said. "The rest I left where it would do its work better than here." "And what rides beyond?" Littlefinger added lightly. "I would venture to guess? Beyond is where men who think themselves clever fall in holes," Brienne said. "I was content to ride on the ground." He smiled, and the smile did not show his teeth, because Podrick had used that phrase earlier to describe a man, and Littlefinger collected such phrases the way other men collected rare coins. "You honor us with your continued survival, Sire," he said. "It makes one hopeful that other things worth preserving might decide to endure simply by seeing an example." Tormund drifted nearer again, the way a great ship drifts nearer to a thing it cannot ignore. He eyed Littlefinger as a man eyes a bird that insists on landing on the line he needs to tie. "What is it with your hands?" he said, puzzled. "That they never look like they've been asked to do anything unpleasant?" "I hire men who enjoy unpleasantness," Littlefinger said amicably. "I try not to deny men their joys." Tormund looked at his own hands, which bore their usual map of scars, and then at Brienne's, which were large and capable and clean. He shrugged, decided the world is sometimes 2 things at once, and there is no profit in insisting it be one, and moved away in search of Stu. The first of the hostages arrived that afternoon, though no one called them that to their faces. A boy of 8 from Ariswell Steading came with a slate under his arm, and the grim determination of children who have been told they are doing something noble and do not yet know how to make that mean less fear. With him came a girl scarcely older from House Serwyn, plaited hair wrapped close and cheeks smudged with travel, and a gloomily handsome teenager of House Tallheart, whose attempt at scorn could not conceal his relief when he saw 2 other young faces in a room full of adults. Their mothers came with them and did not come further in than the door, because the North does not show what it cannot afford to share. Sansa went to them herself, and though she wanted to reach for their hands, she did not. She led the children to a table in the small hall where a bowl of apples sat and 3 wooden tokens lay side by side, and said, "You are guests. Guests do not carry the weight of grown men's promises. You will study, you will eat, you will be kept warm, you will be missed, and then you will be returned when the winter is honest again." The boy nodded so hard his hair flopped. The girl peered at the tokens. The teenager stared at a point on the wall as if that point had insulted him personally and he was considering forgiving it because the room smelled so good of bread. Sansa showed them where the sleeping pallets had been laid, and the woman from the rills who had brought the tokens came with thread already cut and twisted for small hands to have. Jon watched from the doorway, and when a small boy saw him with the alarm children reserved for famous men, Jon shut his eyes for a heartbeat and opened them again so that the boy's fear would find an exit. At dusk, the messenger from White Harbor returned, half-frozen but grease-bright with the pleasure of being the bearer of something that mattered. He carried 3 folded lists bound by string. Each list carried the names of men who had touched Lannister coins since the snow began, where they had taken it, and which hand had handed it on. Alongside the names ran small notes. This one sings when drunk. This one beats his dog. This one holds a door for strangers. This one prays to gods not his own. This one uses his wife's name as a question and never answers it with kindness. Wyman's ink-stained clerk had not been asked to write those last. He had written them because men who list T. NGS cannot bear to leave out what they have noticed. Sansa took the lists with a nod and a thanks and a pittance of coin that was not a pittance to the man who had carried the paper against his belly, so that his sweat would soften the shock of cold enough to keep the ink from cracking. There came also a gift for White Harbor, and the gift was the sort that would have moved an old man to tears. A sloop under no banner had waited in the roads as if the crew had lost its way. The captain had died of an illness that had no name. The first mate reported with a face that practiced sorrow and had learned to make it almost indistinguishable from the true. In the hold lay a carved figurehead of whalebone, long yellow with age, its eyes set with river pearls. The carved face had been a woman's, the Lady of the Knife, who turns the river from its ice in spring. A knowing smile cut into her lip. White Harbor knew the figurehead. It had been lost with a ship 30 years ago off Fair Isle. Many songs had been written for it, and all of them had been sung by men who had not been born when the ship went down. A note hung from the figurehead's neck, a token of past friendship to remind a wise lord that there can be honor in old bonds. It bore the lion's stamp and no signature. Wyman Manderley's eyes had filled despite himself. His clerk had seen that and had not written it down because that was not the kind of noticing that men wanted recorded. When the figurehead was lifted and brought into the hall for all to see, one of the younger Manderleys, sharp, weary, skeptical, had tapped the back with a knuckle and frowned. The hollow sound made two guardsmen exchange a look. Wyman ordered it cut open, and inside they found a rolled sheet. Bills of credit drawn on 3 Lannisport counting houses, and letters to 2 White Harbor merchants offering generous terms on future transactions. The addresses written so a man would feel honored simply to be called by name by Southern coin. Wyman's laugh had been unkind in the way a whale's flukes are unkind to a small boat. At Winterfell, when the report arrived, Sansa smiled without pleasure. "He truly does not read walls," she said of Littlefinger, because she knew whose mind had thought of old grief and figured out how to weigh it with paper. "He reads ledgers and hearts and never thinks maps and minds share a border. Wyman will put the pearls back in the eyes and set the lady where she can be admired," Davos said. "And he will order a feast where men can wipe their mouths and tell each other he has forgiven an insult no one admits was paid. Meanwhile, he will spend the bills of credit on paying our liars and our new roads, and he'll do it through 2 men who never leave the ledger's shadow. It's good. It's what I would do if I were outrageous." A snow squall blew in at sunset and left its work done without making a drama of it. In the morning the world wore a layer that looked soft from the window and betrayed every footstep when a man set out across it. Before dawn, Jon went with Slim Reed's man to a narrow gully that curved like the belly of an old fish and lay 2 inches of drink-thin water beneath a frozen skin. They pushed poles through the ice into the mud and then set branches across the top, done so carefully that the branches looked like careless windfall. A man in armor would step there because it looked good ground. 2 men would go through with a sound that proves a point. Ghost tested the edges with his muzzle and sneezed as if to say the thing smelled like a good trick that would save a long talk later. Back in King's Landing, Qyburn unfolded the message the saboteur had carried back, the one Jon had written for him with care. He read it twice, slowly, without letting his face show anything into the room that the room might later carry elsewhere. The Crown's men who had tried the storehouses and found their torches stopped by a white wolf reported storehouses half empty and carts rolling west. The suggestion to try the rills made sense to a man with a horse and a burning desire to make a show. Cersei's finger rested on the scrawl for a moment. "They're trying to invite us where they want us," she said. "Then we will go where they want us," Qyburn offered, "and spoil the party by being excellent guests. Send a few," she said. "Let them have their victory. Let them chase the glory of stopping an attempt no one asked them to make. Then we'll send men to buy bread in the towns that thought themselves spared, and we'll tell them to pay twice what bread is worth. Their bakers will become our bakers. Then we'll call in debts that don't exist and watch men invent the coin to pay them. Hunger is good at arithmetic." Jaime was not there. Cersei didn't look to the archway, didn't ask where he had gone. Later, over wine so thin it offended her. She asked a page if he had seen the Lord Commander. The page stammered that the Lord Commander had taken a ride alone on the Rose Road. Cersei nodded, as if this answered something other than the question she had asked. Jaime rode without knees today. Sometimes he forgot to press with them and let the horse decide. He found himself at a rise where a burned tree had survived as a black finger. He looked at the finger until it became a woman's arm in a blue cloak on a gray day near a river. He had dreams that were only conversations with things he could not have and did not deserve. He let the horse graze what little it could find and told himself, quite firmly, that he had better things to do than think about rivers. The next first kindness came 1 week after Slim Reed left with Cheese. A small party under a newly contrived banner. Gold lion on black with a grain crown quartered over the top. Attempted to cross a stretch of firm-looking ground on the east side of the King's Road where the land pretended to be friendly. The first 2 men did well. The third did not. The ground took him to the thigh, then to the hip. He screamed with the exact tone of someone remembering that every story he'd mocked as a boy on dry land was true on wet. The first 2 turned back in a hurry, and the 6th in line shoved his fellow forward because a man with a spear has learned to solve problems in one direction only. The Marsh accepted 3 men that day and returned 1, without boots. Word traveled in a way that would later be called rumor, and for now kept 2 other parties from taking the smaller paths. They made a bigger camp than they should have, which made them visible, which made them lonely, which made them stupid, which let free folk and reedmen trade a basket of eels and a story for information that Sansa added to Podrick's neat columns in a second hand. Careless, fearful, proud. Brienne went to the yard and knocked down 3 men who had grown too fond of their own tricks. She did it without humiliation. She simply made them lie on their backs until their pride remembered the floor exists. Tormund watched with the intense attention of a dog watching a pot. When she lowered her blade in courtesy after the last exchange, he huffed a laugh and shook his head. "If I ever decide to die," he said, "I'll do it where I can have the story told by men who know how to use their hands." She did not smile, but her eyes flickered with a light he had come to think of as a special moonrise. Podrick sparred with a boy from House Ryswell who had never been taught to pull a blow and had the long, graceless limbs of men who will someday be beautiful and are at present a menace to furniture. They exchanged hits like boys do, surprised and thrilled, and then appalled at their own thrill when a bruise rose fast. Brienne corrected Pod's left elbow once. Pod corrected his opponent's grip on the hilt without comment that would sting. Men from the Vale looked on and decided northern boys might be worth the work. Letters came and went. Sansa sat with Davos and Jon, and sometimes Brienne, sometimes Wolken, sometimes Lyanna Mormont, and shaped words over hours the way bread is shaped by a patient hand. To Raventree, "You owe us nothing, and yet we ask for your attention." To Seaguard, "Your bell towers still stand. Let them toll without fire." To the apple seller, "The next time a song is sung at Derry, tell me who sings and whether his eye follows the coin or the women." To Wyman, "We are minded to accept your hospitality when the snow thins. In the meantime, do not set the Lady of the Knife too near a fire. Bone cracks at bad times." On a morning of knife blue light and a reasonable wind, a band from the Rills came to the gate with axes that had been sharpened too recently to be for wood. Their leader wore a coat too thin for sense and a hat pulled down over a scar that ran across half his head like a poor man's river. He said, in a voice that had once been made for trading jokes and now could do little besides trade information, "Your letter lied to men for us. Now tell us another lie. They've gone west like you hoped. They'll look for a storehouse where we keep barrels of salt and nowhere else. Tell us what comes next." "Their next move," Davos said, leaning forward as if to confide, "is to wonder why the storehouses in the Rills matter to a north that's decided not to feed the south. They'll think there's something else in those barrels. They'll break 2 open and find salt. They'll break the 3rd and find nothing because you'll set 1 empty and you'll mark the top with a nick 3 fingers from the rim so that another man can open what they leave. In the morning, you'll go and put your fish into the barrel they left and your fish won't rot because salt was there even when you didn't reckon on it." The man glanced sideways at Sansa, measuring where the cunning lay. "We can do that," he said. "We can do harder. We can break our own fence and set it mended wrong so a horse breaks a leg where the ground dips, if that's what you want." I prefer horses, Sansa said, to be on our side, but I prefer men to be slowed more than horses, if you see the scale I measure by. He nodded. We'll do it neat. They won't know why they took so long to leave until they sit down and count the hours, and no one south of here knows how to count time except with bells and stomachs. That night, the wind went south for an hour as if it had a lover there, and then returned smelling of a sea so far no one but Davos could name it by taste alone. He lifted his head and grinned at no one in particular. Sansa saw the look and guessed, and her heart, which had begun to pace its days by the slow winter's beat, managed a quicker measure. Men had begun to laugh in the hall before eating and not only after. That can be the difference between endurance and life. Arya heard those laughs 3 inns away, which is to say she sat on a barrel on a back step with her feet tucked into the frayed openings of a man's boots and listened to a woman scold a dog in a voice that had not yet forgotten delight. She did not smile because her mouth had learned not to and because smiles told men things they did not need to know. She held a cup of something that pretended to be soup and was actually boiled onion and water, and she let the steam go up her nose and remind a small part of her she did not usually permit to be reminded. The man who had tried to sit too close had a hand that would not remember any further. She had cleaned her blade with care. She did not count the names she no longer needed to say before sleep. She had long ago discovered that counting is a way of staying alive and a way of drowning on land. The Brotherhood without banners passed that in on their way to somewhere they hoped would be wise. Barracks I looked like a torch that had left itself burning too many nights at a shrine and had learned to make do with half the oil. Thuras sang without whine because he liked to see what his voice did when it could not lean. The hound, who would have denied he was with them if asked, grunted at a piece of bread that did not tear how bread should tear. A boy with quick eyes and no family name took 2 coppers from a man whose belt pouch looked heavy and replaced the 2 with 1 copper because men with no names sometimes choose that as their rebellion. They would cross into the riverlands and cut a line into a convoy that looked richer than it was. They would find instead 2 men with words better than blades and the courage to say them in broad daylight. They would not kill those men because the hound would be tired. That would save someone later, though no one involved would ever learn to name the cause. Sansa woke early 2 days in a row and baked bread with bruised apples chopped into it for no reason other than that bruised apples wanted better than to be thrown. When a lord of House Ryswell, a sullen man who had lost a brother to the winter's last war and had forgotten how to show gratitude without tarnish, came to pick up his ward, Sansa pressed a loaf into his hands before he could begin his speech. He stopped in the doorway with the uncut loaf held awkwardly, like a baby one does not quite trust one's own arms with. "My lady," he said, and his eyes filled with a startled warmth that embarrassed him. He stumped away with the loaf as if it were dangerous. Slim Reed returned with 3 stories and a wet cap he did not take off because his hair had taken on the shape of it over the years. He told them all 3 stories standing on 1 foot, which is how marsh folk keep warm when they must be out of water and standing. The first story was about a boat with no oars that passed by a group of trees that turned out to be men who had put mud all over themselves and waited to be trees. The second story was about a group of riders who thought they had crossed a river 10 times when they had actually crossed the same river 10 times because it curved around on itself like a snake deciding whether to bite its own tail. The third story was about a message. A man from Seaguard who had made his way up the Green Fork and down again on the Blue to say that Lord Lannister had loosed men with soft boots and hard inclinations to go where Fry Eyes could not. Sansa leaned into that story as into a wind she was sure of. "I can take letters to a place where letters do not go," Slim Reed said. "Or I can take men to a place where men do not go. If I take letters, I'll ask for cheese. If I take men, I'll ask for their mothers' names." "Letters first," Sansa said. "We can spare more paper than blood today. Tomorrow may ask the other." He nodded. "Tomorrow always does." 3 riders from the Eyrie came with Royce's second list and a pouch of small stones. Each stone had been rubbed thumb-smooth by a squire who needed something to do with his hands while his lord gave him a lesson he had already learned. The stones fit into the palm in a way that soothed anxieties about the way the world tilts. Royce's letter said, "The boy plays at Sturness one day, the next he weeps when a falcon will not land. He is still alive. If we can keep him alive through spring, he may grow into a man who learns to shut his mouth before he yells. I send more men. They drink too easily, but they will not betray a northern camp's location because they were never very good at following a map even when sober. Brienne spent a morning in the Godswood, standing under the red eyes with her blade unsheathed but lowered. Sansa found her there not because she had gone looking but because she had gone there herself, and the gods had set them in one another's path out of a sense of humor or necessity or both. They stood side by side a long while without speaking. The wind pushed a standing mat of dry leaves across a patch of ice, and Sansa thought for a foolish second that the ice moved. She smiled at her own mind. "I swore to you," Brienne said eventually. "Once. You swore to my mother," Sansa said. "And to me. And you keep your word so thoroughly that sometimes I worry it will break you in half like a bow that is kept drawn and not allowed to rest." Brienne sheathed the blade without noise and looked at the white face. "I was a girl who wanted songs to be true," she said, as if confessing a minor fault to a god who would appreciate it properly. "Now I am a woman who wants the work to be done." "You are a woman who will keep us honest," Sansa said. "Stay near." "I will," Brienne said, and it was not a vow, only a fact, which made it carry further. When they returned to the yard, two boys were attempting to tie snowshoes for the first time, while a man with patience born of daughters showed them how to wring the straps twice at the toe and once at the ankle. Jon, watching, took a pair and demonstrated failure with cheerfulness. His foot swung and the shoe swung with it like a salvage boat. The boys laughed and then imitated his failure and then imitated the man's success. Tormund tried and nearly took Podrick's eye out by accident. Podrick ducked. Brienne said nothing and tied her snowshoes with more grace than anyone cared to see because they did not want to adore her more than they already did. A week passed with no great news, and therefore with all the news that matters. The fever in the East Barracks went from a stubborn guess to an apology, and then to a memory with a cough trailing behind it. A smithy girl who had not yet learned to measure her iron's temper by sound scorched a strap and learned. A woman from the Bar Rolands taught a northern boy how to thatch a roof so that wind cannot find one straw to pull and ask the next straw to come with it. The wells did not freeze because someone had the mind to keep the buckets swinging even through night watch. The pens at the small rise above the river worked. The cattle learned to walk where the logs were lashed. The raiders from the west came at last under a fog belly and skidded 3 of their number off a path a child would have traversed with no trouble. They left 1 man's spear behind and 3 pair of boots. Lyanna Mormont hung the boots on a nail and said, "Reminders." At noon one day, a boy with eyes like flint arrived from Hornwood with a message about a figure seen near a woodpile where no figure had a right to be. Men went. They found tracks that led to a cave and then led away from the cave with the smaller steps of someone who had lost something. Inside, they found a small book wrapped in oiled leather. It contained a list of names, written in 2 hands, both hands trying to be careful and failing in different ways. The names were of men and women who had taken Lannister coin and did not think anyone would know because no one they knew would tell. It was a copy. The original had likely been burned. This one had been left by someone with a conscience that had tried to live away from itself. Sansa read it and did not look pleased, because a list like that is like a snowdrift that seems small until you put a foot in and discover you are in up to your thigh. "We will not hang anyone for needing to eat," she said. "We will hang anyone who kills for coin and then pretends to have done it for honor. The rest we will put to work in ways they cannot boast of, and that will still feed their children. Some things you can only do in secret if you want them to work," Davos said. "Mercy is like that half the time." Another raven from the Reach came, written in the trembling hand of a steward who knew his lord had already given him orders that would undo everything and had decided to disobey them because he had looked at his children that morning and counted them like coins he wanted to keep. He sent notice that 3 wagons were hidden in a stand of birch 3 miles off the Rose Road at a place where a big rock looked like an old man sitting. Sansa sent men who could move without making talkers. She sent a woman with a scar down our wrist because she had a way of making men who thought themselves sign of trouble decide that they were cold and wanted to go home. They brought the wagons in by night, the horses muffled, the wheels wrapped in cloth. In the morning, 3 empty wagons went east, pulled by 2 fewer horses, and the men who watched from a distance decided Winterfell was either very poor or very clever. That afternoon, a letter arrived from that same steward that said, simply, My lord will say I am dead if asked. I will write again if I am not. Jon and Sansa stood again by the godwood because planning makes a room hot and the gods cool pride. Sansa gave a short report because Jon's eyes were already full of the day. He listened with that bent of head that made men believe he was their accomplice in sense-making, not their judge. When she finished, he said, I asked the men to set their tents closer than they like tonight. There's wind coming that will turn noses stupid. If they're near enough to complain about each other's snoring, they'll be near enough to hear a call if one goes out. I cannot lose 3 to weather because I forgot men like to pretend they're alone. You haven't forgotten anything that cannot bear being forgotten, Sansa said. He gave her a look of gratitude that confessed how rarely such words are said to a commander. Ghost padded from between the trees and pressed his head into Jon's side briefly, a quiet punctuating of the sentence. Sansa looked down at the wolf and felt again the shape of that first day at the heart tree press against her palm. There is a luxury in this, she said, tilting her head to indicate the yard and the hall and the throb of 100 small tasks at once. That makes me afraid. What luxury? Jon asked. To earn our life, she said. To make it by hand with those who will live it beside us. It feels like too good a thing to last. We pay for it, he said. That is how it lasts. She nodded. They turned back toward the hall when Lyanna Mormont's thin, fierce voice split the quiet with the economy of a blade. If you can lift a bucket, you can lift a spear. She was telling a boy with a mouth already poised for a complaint. If you can lift a spear, you can hold it without shaking. If you can hold it without shaking, you can stand a watch. If you can stand a watch, you can save your sister's life. Which part of this do you want not to do? In the south, 2 men in cloaks without house colors argued in a counting room lit by sunlight that had been shepherded through mirrors to make it seem less thin than it was. They were House Lannister's new friends from the west. Money men with old grudges against the Reach for making fortunes in cloth and wine while they worked in, or they showed Qyburn a plan for encouraging the markets of the Trident to seek coin from safer hands. Qyburn nodded and made notes and imagined the heat of a forge he had never stood in. Later, he went to Cersei and said, We can pull a coin from a child's ear if we have to, Your Grace, and make him laugh as we do it. And Cersei said, Odds are the child will be our enemy one day for having learned he can be fooled. She did not smile. She had been born with a smile meant for rooms with many candles, and it had gone out for lack of oil. Jaime returned and reported nothing. He knew the sort of nothing that is sometimes useful. A road with seams that would catch a wheel. A house with too many doors. A bridge with a place to stand and shoot where men would never think to look. He reported those things and did not report the feeling he had had on a hill where a black finger of a tree made him think about blue cloaks. Cersei looked at his face as if it were a map of a country she did not intend to visit again. You're not mine in the way you used to be, she said finally, not putting anger in it because anger gives a thing more shape than it deserves. He looked at her and did not say, I have never been yours in a way that did us any good. When the storm gathered and then broke over Winterfell as if it had been caught by its own arrogance, the hall tightened its habits around the people inside. Ropes went across the yard from door to door, a child's height and 4 men's and 1 at the waist, because a man who puts his hand on a rope while walking through a blizzard has already said yes to being alive and the rope says it back. Tokens went out in 5s. Threads came back in 6s because someone had invented an extra task and the boys had approved. Wolken filled small pouches with a powder of willow and something he would not name and handed them out the way a shopkeeper hands out favors to children. He told the men precisely how much to put into a cup and threatened to sit on them if they poured the whole thing in because they wanted the relief sooner. Sansa stood by the door to the kitchen with her hood up and directed the traffic of bowls with one hand and the traffic of worry with the other. Jon took a tour of the outer wall with 2 men who had learned to mistrust ladders that look sound. He stopped twice to knock ice off a crenel where it had formed teeth that would fall later and cut open a skull. He found a boy asleep at his post and woke him with his hand on the lad's shoulder and a tone that was harder on the lad's despair than it was on his failure. You're going to stand with me now, he said, and you're going to tell me a story about the funniest thing that ever happened to you so your mouth stays moving while your eyes are open. The boy told a story about a goat and a wedding and a pair of breeches, and at the end of it he was embarrassed to have told it, which meant he was warm again. In the deep of that snow, a single rider came from the direction of the twins. His horse blown and his face white in the hollow way that looks like bone put under thin parchment. He held to the rope with one hand and the saddle with the other and was guided in by the ghost of a lantern. He said a name in the first breath, Blackwood, and a second name in the second, Bracken, and then spat blood because he had bitten his tongue somewhere back on a frozen mile. Sansa took him by the elbow and led him to the fire and waited until he had taken the loud upon his breath down to an even quiet. Then he told them. The counting at the twins had turned to sending. Men had gone with grain, not to the west, but to the south, not by the Gold Road but by small backways. Banners had been dipped and changed on the road to trick eyes watching from windows. The fry boy who put the wrong banner up had been hanged for his wrongness, and someone had written in chalk on the gallows post, "We all hang someday. May I choose my rope." Men who meant to be clever and became cruel instead, Brienne said. The rider flinched a little, hearing a woman's voice in a room that had always trained itself not to. "They'll come for Seagard's bridge," Davos said. "Not with an army, too few men and too much marsh. But they'll try to pull down the idea of Seagard by showing they can touch it and not be struck. Lannister will answer the insult," Sansa said. "How many fatherless boys does he have? We risk much if we ask him to set his house to a fire for our sakes. We ask him to let the fire be set where the river can drink it," Jon said. "We ask him for a night of profanity and a morning of calm. He knows both prayers." In the hour before dawn, Sansa stood at her window and watched the storm finish sweeping the yard clean of everyone's footprints. It was the sort of thing that once would have made her fear that they were nothing, that the day could erase them with an hour's work and leave no trace. Now it made her chest fill with the steady, dull pride of someone who has learned to set a path where the snow asks her to. Behind her, on the table by the brazier, the letters for the morning lay in a neat, narrow pile. The topmost was to Riverrun. "Let your men drink, but early. Let them sleep on the floor with their boots on. Let the bells be rung by a woman with a good arm because men ring bells too hard. Keep 2 boats unmoored." The second was to Wyman. "Send 2 barrels with nothing in them but a man's laughter the day he thought he was going to die and did not." The third was to Old Town Steward. "You are not dead until you are dead. Write again." Podrick had fallen asleep at the table while copying the Glover letter in his best careful hand, his cheek on his sleeve and the quill still caught between his fingers. Brienne came in with that silence she had in indoor spaces and moved the quill out of his hand so that his dreams would not be ruined by a blot of ink that would later embarrass him. Sansa looked at the boy a long moment and then put another log on the brazier because that is what women do for boys who fall asleep at their work. She thought of her father then, not as a stone, not as a name in a list of names that men in the South invoked to excuse what they did to his house. She thought of him the way a daughter thinks of a father when she has done something that would have pleased him and cannot ask for his praise. She let the warmth hit her face. She let it be enough for the moment. When dawn did crack, the crack was thin and honest, and the day behind it felt like a thing earned. The storm had scoured everything but the hill where the cattle stood. Their breath rose from that mound like a low white banner. Slim Reed appeared with his cap darker with melt than usual and said, "A man downriver says a boat drifted to his dock in the night with no one on it and a barrel of gold on board. He suspects no good comes of such tricks. He wants to know whether he should burn the gold." "Tell him," Sansa said, "to send the gold with you and to tell the first 5 men he sees a story about a ghost ship. No one believes those. Everyone tells them. Then tell him to count his children and close his shutters." Slim Reed nodded slowly, as if he appreciated the architecture of a thought he had not expected to find in this room. "The Marsh likes you," he said to Sansa. "It likes men who remember the work needs doing more than the song needs singing." "I like anyone who brings cheese," she said gravely, and he laughed once, a short bark like a bird exploring a new call. Jon found time where no time lay and took a turn on the wall with Royce, who had taught a boy to swing a mace with sense and not show, and who stood now with his cloak doing the work of 2 cloaks because age teaches even lords to mind cold as keenly as a farmer. "The Ares men will not marry the snow," Royce said, watching the yard, "but they've learned to court it." You asked for that without asking. I ask men for things in the order they can give them, Jon said. Then I ask for more because they've remembered they can. You've a talent for it, Royce said. Don't let it become your pride. It is not yours. It belongs to the men you're good at leading. If you keep it, it will rot. Jon accepted the correction with the ease of someone who has learned the pleasure in being told where the floor is. If it rots, you may throw it in my face, he said. I will, Royce promised and meant it. A small riot of laughter rolled through the hall at midday when the cobblers opened their cases and men discovered they did not know their own feet. The cobblers did not look up as they measured. They said, I told you so, with their thumbs and fitted boots that would not make a man curse 20 paces out the door. Sansa stood with the ledgers, taking down names and coin and promising credit not with words but with her attention, which men valued more because it could not be spent and left no stain on their pride. When Jon brought his boots over, she balanced them in her hand and said, You'll break these in by walking, not by running. And he nodded as a soldier nods to a healer who has told him not to raise his arm above his shoulder if he hopes to use it again next season. A letter from Deepwood Motte came with tidings short and good. The men who had been seen on the shore were not Greyjoys, not even the branch of them that calls itself iron and forgets it is only rusty. They were Westerners hunting weakness and had taken none. The Lady of Bear Island sent, with her thanks, a small sack of shells rubbed smooth by water that did not know what polishing means. Sansa poured the shells into a bowl near the fire and watched a child stare at them as if they were coins and asked the child later what the shells' names were. The child said, I don't know. And Sansa said, Good, let them be unimportant. And the child loved her for saying a thing that made no sense and made all sense at once. So the days folded and unfolded. Thread tied and counted, wax warmed and made to take the wolf's bite. Men sent where their capabilities weighted the day toward surviving, not toward glory, women seen, children named, the old god's face weathering the weather without comment. In the south, Qyburn petted a rat and decided it was time to invent a charity for the poor that would look like kindness and cost very little and bring him many ears. In the Riverlands, a fisherwoman with shoulders broader than some men's thought better of selling a rumor to the wrong ears, and instead told it to a boy, who would tell it to a girl, who would whisper it to a woman, who would write it down and send it north in a roll of linen. In the Neck, a man set a reed mat across a channel he did not want crossed and lay down on it with his ear to the water until he could hear men cursing for having gotten lost. In Winterfell, Sansa slept less and less and did not write down that fact among the day's costs because there are things a house should not be asked to pay with coin. Jon slept when he remembered to and at odd hours, and woke with his hand already halfway up to grab something a dream had told him would fall if he did not. Ghost woke when the door's latch lifted and lay as if dead when it did not, and once allowed a child to make a necklace of shells around his neck because Sansa had said yes with her eyes. Toward the end of that month, a rider came with a banner none of them had seen in some time. A merman proper, green against white, the paint fresh. It was not Wyman. His knees did not bend like this man's. It was his son, Wyllis, with windburn and a bacon pride and the air about him that belongs to men who have talked long with sailors and liked them despite themselves. He brought with him 3 things: a critique of Winterfell's new stone path. You've set that one wrong. When it freezes, it'll buck. Turn it now. A pair of divers who could hold their breath long enough to check the undersides of bridges for things that want to explode, and news that a young woman with quick hands and a mouth fit for swearing had been seen in an inn near salt pans asking whether the North had taken to eating lions for breakfast. Sansa felt her throat tighten. Not with fear, not with joy, not with anything she could name in front of men. She asked whether the woman had a scar over her left eyebrow. Wyllis shrugged. Maybe. I was told of her by a man who'd heard it of someone else. You know how the sea mumbles. She had a laugh that turned men careful. Jon did not look at Sansa. Sansa did not look at Jon. That was the treaty they had made with each other's hope. Wyllis also brought a cask with 3 seals. One for the lion, one for a hand drawn in red wax, Qyburn's conceit, and one for a merchant's guild of Lannisport. Inside were papers establishing a chartered kindness for widows of the war. The charter required the names and addresses of any woman who wished to apply, the ages of her children, the whereabouts of any male relatives still alive. "They want a list," Davos said. Disgusted admiration reluctantly folded into it. "They want us to give them a list for free that other men would bleed to fill." "We will give them a list," Sansa said. "We will give them the names of the dead who have no widows left. We will give them the names of men we know to be liars who will apply with 3 names each and will be sent to a yard to be counted and then will vanish. We will add some we wish to shelter and make their names read wrong when someone not from here reads them. We will take their coin and will tuck it into the hems of children's cloaks and into seed to be planted if spring remembers us. And when they ask why we have sent these names," Davos asked, almost eager to hear the neatness of the thing, "we will say, because kindness does not ask for reasons," Sansa said, "and because we know, as you knew when you sent the Lady of the Knife, that remembered grief buys time. Let us spend yours. You have so much." When night fell that day, it fell with a grace Sansa took as a compliment the gods did not know how to give. Jon stood in the yard in the place he now went by habit, where he could see the heart tree's pale shoulder and the slice of sky above the east wall and the stepped shadows on the stairs where Sansa had once stood with her scarf tight. He thought of the line Davos had spoken, moments of clean, hard light, and decided the day had given them 3 such moments, and that was 2 more than he had dared hope for when the snow began. He would not count them aloud. He would not make them into a prayer. He would tuck them into a corner of his mind and take them out later when a plan failed and a boy bled and a woman wailed and a man he had depended on told him a thing that was true and that hurt. He would not grow drunk on them. He would let them be what they were, a way to keep walking without tripping on his own pride. In King's Landing, Cersei sat alone in a room with 3 glass vases shaped like tears, each holding a different sort of flower. The flowers were not northern. They were not even what they claimed to be. They had been dyed to pretend at colors that snow has never seen. She reached a finger out and touched a petal and the dye came away faintly, and she smiled at last, because the whole world was a matter of dyes and fingers and petals, and who had the patience to ruin beauty in order to prove it false. She rang a bell. Qyburn came. "Tell the men to tighten their charity," she said. "Tell them to ask for what hurts to give and to send what is easy to refuse. Tell them to make kindness harder. The North will hoard it. A thrifty enemy is easier than a generous one." "Yes, your grace," Qyburn said, and thought about rats and about threads. He thought about a white wolf that had put its paw on a man's chest and won the argument with weight alone. Spring did not come the next week either. It sent a note with the rain putting its first smell on the air and said, "Later." The work went on because the work is the only season men can demand. Sansa woke early again and baked bread she did not eat because watching children eat is sometimes better. Jon walked again and found 2 men arguing only because they were tired. He made them carry water together until their breath matched. Brienne went to the forge and had her sword tightened a notch and thanked the smith with the sort of bow one gives a surgeon. Davos wrote lies that were not lies and truths that needed to look like jokes to get through doors. Podrick found a girl who wanted to learn to tie lashes for the cattle mats and taught her to tie a sailor's knot that will hold until a child's hand tells it to let go. Lyanna stood before a line of boys and told them that they were being given the chance to be worthy of their sisters, and that if they decided to squander it, the girls would be taught to shoot in their stead. And the boys looked at the girls and did not sulk because they had seen the girls' unflinching eyes. And after a week of this, a raven came from Old Town in a hand that had steadied itself for this moment and written, as if there were time enough for every letter to be formed. It said, "We will send another 3 wagons. We will send 2 carts of seed. We will send a man who can mend a mill's guts. We will send, if you will have him, a singer who remembers songs north of the neck. We will send, if you will ask it, myself. My lord will think me dead for a week. If I must be dead to be of use, I will be dead." Sansa read it and set it down and put a finger on the last line and left it there as if to heat it into something permanent. Jon picked it up and put it down and said nothing for a long while. Then he said, "We'll ask him to live. We need men who can remember. And men who can count," Davos added. "We'll take him because he can do both. We'll ask him to write down the names of men he cannot forgive and then set the list aside and write down the names of men he cannot live without. And that will be the list we'll use." Sansa nodded. That small decisive motion her mother had had when a thing had been seen through to its end in the mind before it was begun with the hands. "Write him," she said. "Tell him we will have him. Tell him we will teach him to sand a token and not cut his fingers with the thread." She went to the window then, and the sky was gray the way a pearl is, promising without promising anything in particular. She wondered where Arya was. She wondered whether the girl had seen morning light like this through a window and liked it less than the kind that comes at the end of the day when there are more shadows to hide in. She wondered whether her sister had had an apple that day, and whether it had been bruised, and whether her hands had been clean when she ate it. She did not say any of these things aloud. She folded the thoughts like letters that bore no crest and put them in a place in her heart that no one could search. Jon came to stand beside her. They did not touch. "We move," he said, and it was not a question. "We move," she said. They watched the yard tie its tasks to tokens and the threads loop through and the boys count them and the men glance over the boys' shoulders and see if the addition was correct. They watched Ghost stretch and stand and shake, and the shells around his neck clack softly like a quiet bell. They watched Brienne refuse a second mug of ale and Tormund accept the refusal like a promise he would never press. They watched Davos blow gently on a pool of wax so it would set smooth when the wolf went in and out again. They watched the door and the ways it opened and closed and knew each person by the door's motion. In this way, without trumpet and without poetry, the North made itself ready to answer Southron gold with northern patience, banners with knots, and hunger with the arithmetic of care. And if, that night, two siblings stood separately and both remembered a father who had taught them that right action often looks like dull work until afterwards, the old gods made no comment. They monitored the snow for its own sake, as they always had, and the snow fell with small, steady sounds that said to those with ears to hear, "Keep doing what you are doing. The rest will be asked of you in due time."